Tonight, we're diving into Timbuktu, a city that sits in the middle of a desert, 20 kilometers from the nearest river, getting less than 10 inches of rain per year. By every reasonable standard, this place should not exist. And yet for centuries, it was one of the most important cities in the world. Here's the thing. Everything you think you know about Timbuktu is probably wrong. Europeans spent 500 years convinced it was an African El Dorado lined with gold, dripping with wealth. Explorers died trying to reach it. When they finally arrived, they found sand, poverty, and a level of disappointment that must have been absolutely crushing. But they were looking for the wrong treasure. This is history with all the details they skipped in textbooks, the fascinating, the bizarre, and yes, the occasionally devastating. We're talking about a city founded by nomads who gave it a name that literally means that sandy spot over there. A place where salt was traded pound for pound with gold, where a decentralized university system produced hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, documenting 7 centuries of sophisticated African scholarship, and where, in 2012, a group of librarians pulled off one of the greatest rescues in cultural history while their city was under militant occupation. If you enjoy learning about the place's history class got completely wrong without falling asleep, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into history's most misunderstood corners. And let me know in the comments, what historical myth do you want me to tackle next? Alright, let's start with a geographic impossibility and the nomadic Berbers who looked at it and said, yeah, this'll work. Picture this. You're a nomadic trader crossing the Sahara sometime around the year 1100. You've got salt slabs, you've got camels, and you've got a very specific problem. You need to reach the Niger River, the major artery of West African trade, but you also need to stay close enough to the desert to maintain your northern trade connections. The ideal spot would be right at the transition point where the Sahel grasslands meet the Sahara. There's just one small issue. That transition point is a climatic nightmare. Welcome to Timbuktu, where the mean annual precipitation is consistently less than 10 inches. For context, that's technically desert classification. Most agrarian societies would take one look at this location and keep walking. But the Tuareg, the nomadic Berber peoples who dominated the Sahara, saw something different. They saw a necessary node. The city's existence is entirely predicated on geography. It sits approximately 20 kilometers north of the Great Bend of the Niger River, at the exact point where agricultural West Africa meets the Saharan trade network. This wasn't a convenient location. This wasn't even a particularly nice location, but it was the only location that made logistical sense. So around 1100 AD, the Tuareg established a settlement, probably seasonal at first, a place to pause, trade, and resupply before continuing the grueling journey north or south. The name they gave it reflects its humble origins. According to Malian historian Sakine Sissoko, Timbuktu is a Berber compound word, tin, meaning place of in the feminine form, and buktu, meaning small dune, literally place of the small dune. They looked at a sandy patch in the desert and named it that sandy spot over there. This is not the naming convention of people who expected to build an imperial capital. This is the naming convention of people who needed a landmark so they could find the waterhole again. But here's the fascinating part. That waterhole became essential. Because while Timbuktu's location was geographically awkward for settlement, it was absolutely perfect for commerce. Think of it like this. The Niger River was the highway of West Africa. It connected the gold-producing regions of the south with the agricultural heartland of the Sahel. But if you wanted to move those goods north to the Mediterranean, to the markets of North Africa, to the cities of the Islamic world, to eventually reach Europe, you had to cross the Sahara. And the Sahara doesn't care about your business model. It's hostile, it's vast, and it requires very specific knowledge to traverse safely. The Tuareg had that knowledge. They possessed the logistics, the kinship networks, and the cultural infrastructure necessary to facilitate desert commerce. They had their own ancient written script Tifino, which predates the Aramaic that would later dominate the region. They had a highly stratified social system that organized labor, managed caravans, and maintained trade relationships across thousands of miles. They were, in essence, the FedEx of the medieval Sahara, and Timbuktu was their distribution center. This is important because it establishes something crucial. Timbuktu was a functioning trade nexus before it became famous, before Arab merchants formalized the routes, before Islam provided a universal legal framework for commercial contracts, before any empire claimed it. The city existed because the geographer demanded it exist. It was an inevitability, not an accident. But this also created a fundamental political tension that would define Timbuktu's entire history. On one side, you had the Tuareg, mobile, decentralized, desert-adapted, fiercely independent. Their power came from their ability to move, to control the routes, to operate outside the boundaries of sedentary states. On the other side, you had the empires of the Niger River Basin, centralized, agricultural, bureaucratic, militarily powerful. Their power came from controlling territory, collecting taxes, and maintaining standing armies. Timbuktu sat right at the fault line between these two systems. The Tuareg founded it, but the river empires wanted it. And what river empires want, river empires eventually take. To understand why, you need to understand the political context of the early 12th century. West Africa was in chaos. The Ghana Empire, sometimes called the Wagadu Empire, had been the dominant power in the region for centuries. It controlled the gold trade, commanded tribute from vassal states, and maintained enough military strength to keep the trade routes secure. But in the late 11th century, Ghana collapsed. The reasons are debated. Some sources blame the Almoravid invasion from the north. Others point to internal political fracturing. Still others suggest environmental degradation and drought. Whatever the cause, the result was clear. The regional power structure disintegrated. What followed was a period of intense political fragmentation. Multiple kingdoms competed for control, the Suso rising from the remnants of Ghana's territory. The nascent Mali Empire centered in the Mandinka state of Kangaba. Various smaller polities trying to carve out their own domains. It was a free-fall, and the prize everyone wanted was control of the Niger Bend. Timbuktu, sitting at the northern edge of that choke point, was perfectly positioned to become extremely valuable to whoever won. But here's what's crucial. Even during this period of political instability, Timbuktu continued functioning as a trade center. Empires rose and fell, armies marched back and forth, and the caravans kept moving. Because the geography didn't change. The economic necessity didn't change. The city was too useful to abandon, even when it was dangerous to operate there. This resilience, this ability to maintain commercial function despite political chaos, would become one of Timbuktu's defining characteristics. Over the next 9 centuries, the city would be conquered, occupied, besieged, and marginalized repeatedly. And yet it would persist, because the fundamental logic of its location never stopped being true. But persistence and prosperity are not the same thing. For Timbuktu to transform from a necessary trading post into a legendary center of wealth and learning, it needed something it didn't have: stability. It needed an empire powerful enough to secure the trade routes, wealthy enough to invest in infrastructure, and ambitious enough to see the city as more than just a tax collection point. It needed someone who understood that controlling Timbuktu meant controlling more than just a city. It meant controlling the perception of power itself. Enter the Mali Empire, and more specifically, enter Mansa Musa, man who would turn a desert trading post into the most famous city in Africa. He would do something absolutely unprecedented. He would use gold not as a currency, but as a marketing campaign. Next time you complain about your commute, remember, the Tuareg built a city in the desert 20 kilometers from water because it saved them time on their supply chain. Priorities. But those priorities were about to pay off in ways nobody could have predicted, because a Mandinka prince named Sundiata was about to do something the Soso thought was impossible. And when his descendant made a pilgrimage to Mecca 2 centuries later, he was going to make sure the entire world knew exactly where all that gold came from. In 1324, a West African king walked into Cairo with so much gold that he accidentally crashed the Mediterranean economy for a decade. This wasn't just wealth. This wasn't even just a pilgrimage. This was a marketing campaign so effective that Europeans were still drawing maps based on it 50 years later, despite never having visited the continent. His name was Mansa Musa, ruler of the Mali Empire, and he understood something that most medieval monarchs didn't. Perception is power. And if you want to change perception on a global scale, you need to do something so outrageous that people literally cannot stop talking about it. Mission accomplished. But before we get to the legendary Hajjata pilgrimage that made Mansa Musa famous, we need to understand how the Mali Empire came to dominate West Africa in the first place. Because empires don't just appear. They're built usually through a combination of military brilliance, strategic marriages, and exploiting the fact that your enemies underestimated you. The Mali Empire's origin story centers on a man named Sundiata Keita, and like all good origin stories, it starts with an underdog, a prophecy, and a villain who really should have seen this coming. In the early 13th century, the dominant power in the region was the Soso kingdom, ruled by a king named Sumoro Kanti. Sumoro was powerful, militarily successful, and by most accounts, not particularly interested in sharing. He conquered the Mandinka territories, including the small state of Kangaba, and established himself as the regional hegemon. The Mandinka princes were either killed or forced into exile, except for Sundiata. According to the epic of Sundiata, which was passed down orally by griots for centuries before being written down, Sundiata was initially dismissed as a threat. He was disabled as a child, unable to walk, considered weak. Sumoro let him live because he didn't think he mattered. This was a mistake. Sunyata eventually overcame his disability, went into exile, built a coalition of allies, and returned to challenge Soso dominance. The climactic battle is said to have occurred at Kirina around 1235. Sundiata's forces defeated Sumero, and the Soso kingdom collapsed. What rose in its place was the Mali Empire, with Sundiata as its founder and the Mandinka as its ruling class. Now, here's where it gets interesting for Timbuktu. The Mali Empire grew rapidly. Sundiata and his successors expanded control over the gold-producing regions to the south, and the critical trade routes that connected them to the Sahara. By the time Mansa Musa ascended to the throne in the early 14th century, likely around 1312, Mali was already one of the largest states in the world. It controlled vast territories across the West African savanna, dominated the trans-Saharan trade, and had more gold flowing through its system than most kingdoms could even conceptualize. Mansa Musa inherited an empire, but he wanted a legacy. In 1324, he embarked on his Hajj to Mecca. This was a religious obligation for Muslims who could afford it, but Mansa Musa approached it less like a pilgrimage and more like a royal procession designed to announce his existence to the Islamic world. The scale was absurd. Reports vary, but most sources suggest he traveled with a caravan of 60,000 people, including soldiers, officials, merchants, and enslaved people. He brought 12,000 personal attendants. Each of the 80 camels in the procession reportedly carried 300 pounds of gold. Mansa Musa himself distributed gold to everyone he encountered along the route, giving it away in the markets of Cairo, spending lavishly in Mecca, handing it out like promotional flyers. And this is where the economic consequences become hilarious. In retrospect, Mansa Musa gave away so much gold in Cairo that he flooded the market. Supply and demand is a harsh mistress, and when you suddenly increase the gold supply by an order of magnitude, the value collapses. Gold prices in Cairo, Mecca, and Medina plummeted. The inflation was so severe that it took more than a decade for the regional economy to recover. Some sources suggest the effects were felt for 12 years. Imagine being so rich that you accidentally break the concept of money. That's not wealth. That's a superpower. But here's the strategic brilliance. Mansa Musa knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't carelessness. This was branding. He wanted everyone in the Mediterranean world to know that Mali was unimaginably wealthy, that its king was pious and generous, and that if you wanted access to West African gold, you needed to deal with Mali. The economic disruption was a side effect. The global reputation was the goal, and it worked spectacularly. By the time Mansa Musa returned to Mali, his fame had spread across the Islamic world and into Europe. The Catalan Atlas, created in 1374, 50 years after the Hajj, depicts Mansa Musa seated on a throne, holding a golden scepter and a massive gold nugget, with Timbuktu explicitly labeled as Tonbuddy on the map. This is one of the earliest European cartographic representations of West Africa, and it's centered on Mali's king. Europeans who had never set foot in Africa, who had no direct trade relationships with the region, were drawing maps with Mansa Musa as the focal point. That's not just effective diplomacy. That's multimedia marketing before multimedia existed. But Mansa Musa didn't just spend gold, he invested it. On his return journey from Mecca, he stopped in Timbuktu. The city was already functioning as a trade hub. but it wasn't yet integrated into the Mali Empire's administrative structure. Mansa Musa changed that. He peacefully annexed Timbuktu in 1324, bringing it under imperial control without the need for military conquest. The city's leaders recognized that joining Mali meant access to stability, protection, and imperial investment. Resistance would have been expensive and pointless. And invest Mansa Musa did. He brought architects and scholars from across the Islamic world to Mali. He commissioned the construction of grand mosques and learning centers. The Jingaraba Mosque in Timbuktu, one of the city's most iconic structures, was designed by Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, an Andalusian architect Mansa Musa recruited during the Hajj. These weren't just religious buildings. They were statements. They communicated that Mali wasn't some peripheral desert kingdom, was a sophisticated Islamic state worthy of respect and scholarly engagement. This state-sponsored investment transformed Timbuktu almost immediately. The city became a destination for Islamic scholars, jurists, and theologians from North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. The gold revenue of the empire subsidized the creation of a major learning center, and that learning center, in turn, reinforced Mansa Musa's legitimacy as a pious Muslim ruler. It was a feedback loop. Wealth funded scholarship. Scholarship generated prestige, attracted more scholars, and more scholars enhanced Mali's reputation. Okay, here's the crucial part. Timbuktu's greatest success was intellectual, not financial. Yes, it was a wealthy trade hub, but so were a lot of cities. What made Timbuktu legendary was the convergence of commerce and learning. The same caravans that brought salt and textiles also brought books, manuscripts, and scholars. The same merchant class that traded gold also funded madrasas. The city became a place where you could study advanced jurisprudence, debate theology, and learn astronomy all while living in a thriving commercial metropolis. Mansa Musa understood something fundamental. Cultural capital lasts longer than gold. Gold gets spent. Gold gets stolen. Gold inflates currencies in Cairo and causes diplomatic headaches. But knowledge creates institutions. Knowledge trains the administrators, judges, and religious leaders who keep an empire functioning. Knowledge generates loyalty among intellectual elites who benefit from your patronage. So while the legend of Mansa Musa focuses on the goldland, to be fair, the gold was impressive. The real legacy was what he built with it. He turned Timbuktu into a city that mattered not because of what it had, but because of what it knew. And this is where the European myth starts to diverge from reality. Europeans heard about Mansa Musa's gold. They saw him on maps, holding his golden orb. They heard tales of a king who gave away so much wealth that he destabilized economies. And they assumed, because this is what colonizers always assumed, that the wealth was just sitting there waiting to be taken. They imagined Timbuktu as a city lined with gold, streets paved with precious metals, a treasure vault in the desert. They completely missed the point. Timbuktu was never a gold mine. It was a port. The gold came from the south, from regions like Bambouk and Burand, flowed through Timbuktu on its way north. The city's wealth came from its position in the network, not from production. It was a logistical hub, a commercial nexus, a place where value was exchanged and transformed, but not created from the ground. But the myth was more compelling than the reality, and myths have a way of outlasting the truth, especially when the people perpetuating the myth have ships, guns, and a deep-seated need to justify their imperial ambitions. For now, though, Timbuktu enjoyed the benefits of imperial patronage. Mansa Musa's reign established the city as a center of learning and trade, under the protection of one of the world's most powerful empires. Scholars flocked to the city. Wealth flowed through its markets. The mosques and madrasas expanded. For nearly a century, Timbuktu thrived as part of the Mali imperial system. But empires don't last forever. Political power is always temporary, and while Mansa Musa had built something remarkable, his successors would struggle to maintain it. By the mid-15th century, Mali's grip on the region was weakening. Tributary states began asserting independence. Trade routes shifted. And the Songhu had once been subjects of Molistat, looking at the Niger Bend with ambition. Timbuktu had flourished under centralized imperial control. It was about to find out what happened when that control collapsed. Next time you complain about inflation, remember, at least you didn't personally cause it by being too generous with gold bars in Cairo, Mansa. Musa set the bar high literally and economically, but golden ages are called golden ages for a reason. They're rare, they're fragile, and they end, usually violently. Picture a market where you could trade a pound of salt for a pound of gold, not metaphorically, not roughly equivalent in value, actually pound for pound, weight for weight exchange. This sounds insane until you remember that salt is necessary for human survival, and gold is shiny but nutritionally useless. Welcome to the trans-Saharan economy, where basic chemistry was worth more than precious metals, and the people who controlled the choke points became obscenely wealthy. Timbuktu was one of those choke points. And understanding why requires understanding the entire system, because this wasn't just trade. This was a continental-scale supply chain that moved luxury goods, essential commodities, human beings, and intellectual materials across one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Let's start with the core economic engine: gold and salt. West Africa in the 14th and 15th centuries produced approximately 2/3 of the entire world's gold supply. This wasn't a minor export. This was the foundation of the global medieval economy. The gold came primarily from regions south of Mali, places like Bambouk, Bior, and later the Akan goldfields. These were alluvial deposits and underground mines worked by local communities and controlled by the empires that dominated the savannah. That gold moved north. Because while West Africa had gold in abundance, it had one critical shortage: salt. Salt is one of those things modern people completely take for granted. You grab it at the grocery store, you sprinkle it on food, you don't think about it. But in a pre-industrial society, especially in tropical regions where people sweat constantly and agriculture requires salt for preservation and livestock health, salt is essential. It's not optional. It's a biological necessity. West Africa's tropical zones didn't have significant salt deposits. The geology just didn't cooperate. So where do you get salt when your region doesn't produce it? You import it. From the desert? The Sahara, for all its hostility, has massive salt deposits. The most famous is Tagaza, a mining settlement several hundred miles north of Timbuktu, literally in the middle of the desert. Tagaza wasn't a city. It was a salt mine with minimal infrastructure. worked primarily by enslaved laborers who extracted massive slabs of salt from underground deposits. The working conditions were brutal. The environment was lethal. The salt was worth it. Those salt slabs, some weighing up to 200 pounds, were loaded onto camels and transported south in caravans. The journey from Talgazar to Timbuktu took weeks. The route crossed open desert with limited water sources, extreme temperature variations, and the constant threat of getting lost or ambushed. Caravans could include hundreds or even thousands of camels. Organized by merchant families who specialized in this trade and who maintained kinship networks across the route to facilitate logistics. And here's where the economics get fascinating. The transportation cost was astronomical. Moving those salt slabs from the desert floor to Timbuktu's markets required caravan merchants to charge fees that amounted to nearly 80% of the salt's final value. 80%. That's not a typo. The logistical cost of crossing the Sahara was so high that the markup was almost as much as the commodity itself. But people paid it. Because the alternative was not having salt. And not having salt meant livestock died, food spoiled, and people suffered nutritional deficiencies that could be fatal. So salt arrived in Timbuktu, marked up by 80%, and was exchanged sometimes literally weight for weight with gold coming from the south. The merchant families who controlled this exchange became extraordinarily wealthy, not because they produced anything, but because they controlled the node where scarcity intersected with necessity. This is the structural advantage Timbuktu held. The city didn't mine gold, it didn't mine salt, but it sat at the exact geographic point where the people who needed salt met the people who needed gold. And both sides were desperate enough to accept almost any terms. Think of it like medieval Amazon, except instead of next-day delivery, you waited 6 weeks, and instead of a subscription service, you paid an 80% logistics fee. And if the caravan got lost, everyone died. Customer satisfaction was not guaranteed. But the gold-salt exchange was only part of the system. The Trans-Saharan trade network moved a staggering diversity of goods in both directions, creating a genuinely global economy centuries before the Atlantic system developed. From North Africa and the Mediterranean world, caravans brought high-value manufactured goods, fine textile silk and cotton fabrics that indicated status and wealth, horses, which were critical for military power and couldn't be bred effectively in the tsetse-fly zones of the south, copper, used for everything from currency to decoration to tools, weapons and armor, glassware, pottery, and crucially, books and writing materials. That last category is important. The same trade routes that moved salt and gold also moved intellectual capital. Islamic scholars traveling to Timbuktu brought manuscripts with them. Merchants purchased books in Cairo or Tunis and sold them in Timbuktu's markets. Paper, ink, and binding materials were trade goods. The intellectual flourishing of Timbuktu wasn't separate from its commercial success, was directly enabled by it. The book trade and the salt trade used the same infrastructure. Moving south from Timbuktu, caravans exported West African products. Gold, obviously, was the star commodity, but also enslaved people, captured in warfare or raids and sold into the trans-Saharan slave system, a trade that predated the Atlantic system and continued alongside it. Ivory from elephants hunted in the savannah, coal and nuts which were stimulants used across the Islamic world. Exotic animal products like ostrich feathers and leather goods. The scale of this trade is hard to overstate. A single large caravan could include thousands of camels, hundreds of merchants, armed guards, guides, and support staff. The coordination required was immense. You needed reliable water sources mapped out. You needed relationships with the Tuareg and other desert groups who controlled the routes, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through tribute payments. You needed to time your departure to avoid the worst of the summer heat. You needed credit networks that spanned thousands of miles so that merchants could extend loans and settle accounts across borders. And it all funneled through Timbuktu. The city's position gave it enormous economic leverage, but that leverage was entirely dependent on imperial stability. The reason Timbuktu flourished under Molians, later under Songhai, was that those empires maintained security. They kept the trade routes open. They suppressed banditry. They enforced contracts through Islamic legal systems. They provided the predictable governance that allowed merchants to plan expensive, risky expeditions with some confidence they'd actually arrive. Without that stability, the system collapsed. And this is crucial for understanding Timbuktu's later decline. The city's wealth was structural, not intrinsic. It wasn't rich because it had resources. It was rich because empires made it safe to do business there. When the empires failed, the trade routes shifted, and Timbuktu's monopoly evaporated. But for now, during the 14th, 15th, and early 16th centuries, the system worked. Gold flowed north. Salt flowed south. Books, textiles, horses, and enslaved people moved in both directions. And Timbuktu's merchant class, positioned at the center of it all, accumulated wealth and used that wealth to fund the city's intellectual life. Because here's the thing about successful merchants. They need educated children. They need people who can read contracts, calculate exchange rates, navigate Islamic inheritance law, and maintain business relationships across cultural boundaries. A thriving commercial city inevitably creates demand for education. And Timbuktu, flush with trade, wealth, and imperial patronage, developed one of the most sophisticated educational systems in the medieval world. The gold paid for the buildings. The trade paid for the city. But what paid for the legacy that required scholars, students, and a decentralized learning system that turned the city into something more than just a market? Next time you complain about shipping costs on Amazon, remember, at least you're not paying 80% of the item's value just to get it delivered. Medieval logistics were not messing around. But economics only tells you how a city becomes rich. It doesn't tell you how a city becomes legendary. For that, you need universities. Or more accurately, you need a completely decentralized network of independent scholar-run schools that somehow work better than most formal universities of the same era. And yes, this actually happened. Sanka University had no central administration, no single campus, and no standardized curriculum. Classes met in mosques, in courtyards, and in professors' private homes. Students studied under individual scholars who set their own standards, charged their own fees, and taught whatever they deemed important. There was no dean. There was no board of trustees. There was no university president sending out fundraising emails. And it worked better than most European universities of the same era. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate system designed to be flexible, resilient, and responsive to the needs of a commercial empire that required educated administrators, judges, merchants, and religious leaders. Timbuktu's intellectual infrastructure was built to survive political instability, and the decentralized model is exactly what allowed it to do that. When empires collapsed, the university didn't. When rulers changed, the scholars kept teaching. Because the system wasn't dependent on state patronage, it was embedded in the social fabric of the city itself. Let's start with the physical infrastructure, because it helps explain how this worked. Timbuktu's intellectual life centered on three great mosques: Jingareba, Sidi Yahya, and Sanka. These weren't just places of worship. They were multifunctional community centers that served as lecture halls, libraries, legal courts, and gathering spaces for scholarly debate. Each mosque had associated madrasas, Islamic schools where students could study. But the teaching wasn't centrally organized. Instead, individual scholars established their own schools, often operating out of their homes or renting space in the mosque complexes. Think of it as a franchise model. Each professor was essentially running an independent educational business. They attracted students based on their reputation, their expertise in particular subjects, and their connections to scholarly networks across the Islamic world. If you wanted to study astronomy, you found a professor known for astronomy. If you wanted to specialize in Maliki jurisprudence, the dominant legal school in West Africa, you found a jurist with credentials and experience. This created competition. Scholars had to maintain their reputations to attract students. They had to stay current with developments in their fields. They had to produce work that other scholars respected. The decentralized model functioned as a quality control mechanism. Bad teachers lost students, and without students, you lost income and prestige. The curriculum was remarkably broad, and this is where Timbuktu distinguished itself from purely theological education. Yes, religious studies were central. This was an Islamic learning center, after all. Students studied the Quran, the Hadiths, Islamic jurisprudence, and the sciences of spiritual purification. These were non-negotiable if you wanted to be considered educated in an Islamic context. But the curriculum didn't stop there. Students also studied Arabic grammar and rhetoric, essential for reading classical texts and composing legal documents. Mathematics, because you needed it for calculating inheritance shares, managing trade accounts, and surveying land. Geography, because knowing trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and regional politics was critical for anyone involved in commerce or governance. History, to understand political legitimacy and the precedents that informed legal decisions. And then the sciences: astronomy, physics, chemistry, and medicine. Astronomy was particularly important, and for very practical reasons. If you're a Muslim in West Africa, you need to know the direction of Mecca for prayer. You need to know the lunar calendar for determining Ramadan and other religious observances. You need to be able to navigate using celestial bodies if you're traveling on pilgrimage or managing caravans. This wasn't abstract knowledge, this was essential professional competency. Some of the Timbuktu manuscripts contain astronomical tables, including references to the work of Ibn Yunus, a 10th century Egyptian astronomer. The scholars weren't just importing this knowledge, they were adapting it, testing it against local observations, and teaching it to students who would use it in practical contexts. This is applied science integrated into a broader educational framework. Medicine was similar. The manuscripts include medical texts that describe treatments, surgical procedures, and pharmacology. These weren't theoretical exercises. These were manuals for practitioners who needed to treat patients in a city that was regularly ravaged by disease, where caravans brought epidemics along with trade goods, and where the climate itself posed health challenges. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. The curriculum included trade and business ethics. This makes perfect sense when you remember that Timbuktu was a commercial city. The merchant class needed children who could manage complex business relationships, negotiate contracts, extend credit, and navigate disputes according to Islamic law. So students learned the rules of commercial transactions, the ethics of fair dealing, the legal frameworks for partnerships and inheritance. This wasn't optional enrichment. This was vocational training for the city's economic elite. The education system had 4 levels, essentially functioning as degrees. Students progressed through increasingly advanced study, and upon completion, they received a turban as their graduation symbol. The turban wasn't just decorative, it represented divine light, wisdom, knowledge, and moral conduct. It was a visible marker of educational achievement that carried social weight. Your diploma was a hat, and people respected the hat. The most advanced degree required intense research and specialized study under a Shika-recognized master scholar. This level focused on philosophical and religious debates, producing highly skilled jurists and religious leaders who could interpret law, issue legal opinions, and provide the intellectual framework for governance. These weren't just scholars, they were the people who made the empire function. They drafted treaties, they settled disputes, they legitimized political authority through religious and legal reasoning, and crucially, they trained the next generation. This is what made the system resilient. When political power changed hands-on in Timbuktu, it changed hands frequently. The scholarly class remained. They maintained institutional memory, they preserved texts, they continued teaching. The universities weren't dependent on a single patron or a centralized state apparatus. They were embedded in family networks, merchant wealth, and community respect. Compare this to medieval European universities. Oxford, founded around 1190. Bologna, even earlier. These were also important centers of learning, but they operated very differently. European universities had centralized administration, formal charters, and close relationships with church and state authorities. This gave them stability, but it also made them vulnerable to political interference. When kings or popes had disputes with universities, they could shut them down, revoke charters, or force faculty into exile. Timbuktu's decentralized model avoided this vulnerability. No single authority could shut down the university because there was no single university to shut down. There were dozens of scholars, hundreds of students, and a distributed network of knowledge production that couldn't be easily disrupted. This doesn't mean the system was perfect. Decentralization had costs. There was no standardized curriculum, which meant educational quality varied depending on which scholar you studied under. There was no formal accreditation system, so your reputation depended entirely on who your teachers were and what scholarly networks you could access. And while some sources suggest women could attend lectures and study, the system was overwhelmingly male-dominated, reflecting the broader gender dynamics of medieval Islamic societies. But for its time and context, the system was remarkably effective. It produced jurists who administered Islamic law across West Africa. It trained astronomers who maintained calendars and navigational knowledge. It educated merchants who managed complex international trade. It preserved and expanded a body of written knowledge that documented 7 centuries of intellectual activity. And it did all of this without a university president, a board of trustees, or a single administrative building. The scholars of Timbuktu understood something important. Knowledge isn't contained in institutions, it's contained in people. Buildings can be destroyed, governments can collapse, but if you train enough scholars, distribute knowledge widely enough, and create incentives for intellectual production, the knowledge survives. They were about to need that resilience, because Timbuktu's golden age produced an enormous amount of written material, and those manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them, would become both the city's greatest treasure and its most vulnerable target. Next time you complain about student loans or college administration, remember, at least your diploma isn't a hat, and your university has a website. Medieval Timbuktu was running the entire system on personal reputation and word-of-mouth marketing. But personal reputation only matters if people can verify your credentials, and in a literate society, that means you need receipts. Lots of receipts, written down, preserved for centuries. Welcome to the manuscript legacy. It's about to get really impressive and slightly obsessive. Timbuktu's greatest treasure wasn't locked in a vault. It wasn't displayed in a royal palace. It wasn't even kept in a central library where scholars could conveniently access it. Instead, it was scattered across hundreds of private homes, packed in wooden trunks, wrapped in leather, and stored in conditions that ranged from pretty good to actively hostile to paper preservation. And that dispersion, that seemingly chaotic, decentralized storage system is exactly what saved it. We're talking about manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of them, covering 7 centuries of intellectual production, documenting everything from astronomical observations to legal disputes to medical recipes to philosophical debates to someone's extremely detailed accounting of a business transaction in 1437. The estimates vary depending on who's counting and what they're counting, but the most comprehensive surveys suggest Timbuktu and the surrounding region preserved up to 348,000 manuscripts. That's not individual pages, that's individual documents. Some are single sheets, some are multi-volume works running hundreds of pages. Some are elaborately illustrated. Some are hazily scribbled notes. All of them are evidence of a sophisticated, literate culture that wrote everything down. And I mean everything. These weren't just religious texts, though there are plenty of those. The manuscript collection includes historical chronicles, biographical dictionaries, legal treatises, trade contracts, property deeds, astronomical tables, mathematical proofs, medical textbooks, poetry, philosophical essays, and what can only be described as extremely specific arguments about extremely specific points of Islamic jurisprudence that probably only mattered to the 3 people involved in the original dispute. This is what a living intellectual culture looks like. It's not just the great works, it's the mundane documentation of daily life, the working papers of scholars refining their ideas, the teaching materials used in classrooms, the correspondence between intellectuals debating across distances. It's the receipts, all of them. Let's start with the heavy hitters, the works that established Timbuktu's reputation and that continue to serve as primary sources for West African history. The Tariq al-Sudan, written by Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, between roughly 1629 and 1656, is one of the most important historical chronicles of the region. The title translates to Chronicle of the Sudan, and here Sudan refers to the Balad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks, the Arabic term for the West African Savannah region. The chronicle documents the Islamization of the region, the rise and fall of empires, the biographies of important scholars and rulers, and the social dynamics of the Niger Bend during the height of imperial power and the subsequent collapse. Al-Sadi was writing during and after the Moroccan invasion. He lived through the dramatic end of the Songhai Empire and the chaotic Amma period that followed. His chronicle is both historical analysis and eyewitness testimony. It's invaluable for understanding not just what happened, but how contemporary scholars interpreted what happened and what they thought was important to preserve. The Tariq al-Fatash, compiled by Mahoud Kati and his grandson in the 17th century, covers similar ground but with different emphases. It focuses heavily on the Songhai Empire, documenting social, cultural, and religious life with a level of detail that makes it an essential source for anyone studying the period. Katie's work also includes genealogies, which were politically important. Knowing who was related to whom helped establish claims to authority and inheritance. Then there's Ahmed Baba, and we need to talk about Ahmed Baba because this man was Timbuktu's intellectual superstar. Ahmad Baba was born in 1556 and died in 1627. He was a scholar, jurist, biographer, and bibliophile who authored dozens of works on Islamic law, theology, and the intellectual history of the region. His most famous work, Nail Abib-Tahaj, is a biographical dictionary documenting the Maliki scholars of the Sahel, essentially a who's who of West African Islamic intellectuals. This wasn't just academic record-keeping. This was Ahmad Baba establishing the intellectual legitimacy of West African scholarship by demonstrating its connections to the broader Islamic world. Ahmad Baba's personal library reportedly contained 1,600 books. In the 16th century, for context, that's a larger personal collection than most European nobles possessed at the time. This wasn't someone casually interested in reading. This was someone obsessed with knowledge, who spent a significant portion of his wealth acquiring texts, and who viewed scholarship as the highest calling. And then the Moroccans invaded, and Ahmed Baba was deported to Marrakesh along with other Timbuktu scholars. He spent years in exile, continued writing, eventually returned to Timbuktu, and kept working until his death. The man was unstoppable. Empires could collapse around him, and he'd still be writing biographical entries and legal opinions. This is the attitude that preserved the manuscripts. The scholarly class in Timbuktu didn't view books as luxury goods. They viewed them as essential infrastructure. You needed books to teach. You needed books to practice law. You needed books to maintain your reputation in scholarly networks. So you acquired them, you copied them, you preserved them, and you passed them down to your descendants as valuable inheritance. The subject matter of the manuscript collection is staggeringly diverse, and this diversity is what makes it so valuable for modern historians. There are astronomical manuscripts that include star charts, lunar tables, and calculations for determining prayer times. Some reference the work of Ibn Yunus and other Islamic astronomers, demonstrating that Timbuktu's scholars were engaged with the cutting edge of contemporary science. This wasn't isolated intellectual activity, was participation in a global knowledge network. There are medical manuscripts describing treatments for diseases, surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and diagnostic methods. Some of this knowledge came from classical Islamic medical texts, but there's also evidence of local innovations and adaptations treatments that worked in West Africa's specific disease environment and climate. There are mathematical manuscripts covering arithmetic, algebra, and geometry. These were practical tools for merchants, tax collectors, surveyors, and anyone else who needed to calculate areas, volumes, exchange rates, or inheritance shares according to Islamic law. There are legal manuscripts, so many legal manuscripts covering every conceivable aspect of Islamic jurisprudence, property disputes, marriage contracts, divorce settlements, inheritance divisions, commercial partnerships, criminal cases. The manuscripts document centuries of legal reasoning, showing how scholars applied Maliki law to specific West African contexts. This is how you see Islamic law being localized and adapted rather than simply imposed. And then there are the manuscripts written in local African languages using Arabic scripto practice called ajami. This is huge. This is the part that directly refutes the colonial myth of Africa as a continent without written history. Arabic was the scholarly lingua franca, the language of formal education and international communication. But scholars also wrote in Songhay Tamashek, Fula, Bambara, and other local languages, using Arabic letters to represent sounds that didn't exist in Arabic. This allowed Islamic knowledge to spread beyond the Arabic-educated elite. It allowed local histories, poetry, and cultural knowledge to be recorded in written form. It created a truly multilingual intellectual culture that could operate across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The Ajami manuscripts are evidence that Islam in West Africa wasn't just imported wholesale from the Middle East. It was adapted, translated, and integrated into existing cultural frameworks. The religion spread, but it also changed in the process, becoming distinctly West African in expression while remaining recognizably Islamic in substance. Now here's the critical part. These manuscripts weren't stored in a central library. They were kept in private households. This happened for several reasons. First, book ownership was a mark of prestige and family heritage. Manuscripts were valuable property passed down through generations, sometimes with ownership notes and genealogies written in the margins. Families took pride in their manuscript collections, the way modern families might take pride in photo albums or heirlooms. Second, there was a practical concern about security. Centralized libraries are single points of failure. They can burn, they can be looted, they can be destroyed by invading armies, by keeping manuscripts dispersed across hundreds of households. The community inadvertently created a backup system. You couldn't destroy Timbuktu's intellectual heritage with a single act of arson because there was no single target. This proved crucial multiple times. Third, the manuscripts weren't just historical artifacts, they were working documents. Legal scholars needed access to precedents. Teachers needed texts for instruction. Families needed property deeds and marriage contracts. The manuscripts were in private homes because that's where they were being used. But dispersed storage created its own problems. Climate is brutal to paper. Timbuktu's environment alternates between extreme heat and humidity depending on the season. Insects eat organic materials. Dust accumulates. Without climate control and professional conservation, manuscripts deteriorate. Some of the Timbuktu manuscripts show significant damage, pages eaten by termites, ink faded by exposure, bindings disintegrated, and yet they survived. For centuries, families maintained these collections, passing them down, sometimes adding new works, protecting them through periods of political chaos and economic decline. The decentralized preservation system worked, even if it wasn't perfect. In the late 20th century, organizations began attempting to catalog and preserve the manuscripts systematically. The Ahmad Baba Institute of Higher Learning and Islamic Research was established, eventually housing a significant collection. Private family libraries began allowing access to readers. International organizations provided funding for digitization projects. And then 2012 happened, and suddenly the fact that manuscripts were still stored in private households became either a catastrophic vulnerability or a brilliant survival strategy, depending on how you look at it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the manuscripts could be rescued, Timbuktu had to survive the end of its golden age. The scholars had produced an incredible body of work during the Mali and Songhai periods. They'd documented everything. They'd trained generations of students. They'd established Timbuktu as one of the intellectual capitals of the Islamic world. And then the Songhai Empire collapsed violently, and everything changed. Next time you complain about losing a Word document because you forgot to save, remember, Timbuktu's scholars preserved hundreds of thousands of manuscripts through multiple imperial collapses, invasions, civil wars, and climate crises using wooden boxes and family responsibility. Your cloud backup has nothing on intergenerational commitment. But preservation only matters if there's something worth preserving after the empire falls. And when the Songhai lost control of Timbuktu, they didn't lose it peacefully. In 1469, Sunni Ali Bear rolled into Timbuktu with an army and immediately started killing scholars. This is not typically how you maintain an intellectual capital. This is, in fact, the exact opposite of what you should do if you want your newly conquered city to remain valuable. But Sunni Ali had different priorities, and preserving centers of learning was not high on the list. The Songhai takeover of Timbuktu marks one of those historical moments where you can see the consequences unfolding in real time, and you just want to reach through the centuries and say, stop. Think about this. You're about to make a terrible decision. But history doesn't work that way, and Sunni Ali was not interested in feedback. To understand how this happened, we need to back up and look at the broader political situation in the mid-15th century. The Mali Empire, which had dominated West Africa for nearly 2 centuries, was declining. Not collapsing all at once, some empires rarely do, but gradually losing control over tributary states, struggling to maintain trade route security, and dealing with succession disputes that weakened central authority. This is what imperial decline looks like. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow erosion of power where vassals stop paying tribute. Regional governors start acting independently, and the empire's ability to project force diminishes year by year. The Songhai had been part of Mali's imperial system, centered in their capital of Gao. Further east, along the Niger River, they'd paid tribute, they'd acknowledged Mali's supremacy. They'd participated in the trade networks under Mali's protection. But as Mali weakened, the Songhai recognized an opportunity. The Songhai weren't newcomers to power, they had their own long history as a regional force. But under the leadership of Sunni Ali Bey, who ruled from 1464 to 1492, they transformed from a regional kingdom into an expanding empire. Sunni Ali was a brilliant military commander, and by brilliant, I mean extremely effective at conquering territory through relentless warfare. He expanded Songhai control across the Niger Bend, absorbing former Mali territories and establishing Songhai as the new dominant power. Timbuktu, sitting at the strategic northern edge of the Niger Bend, controlling access to the trans-Saharan trade routes, was an obvious target. In 1469, Sunni Ali's forces took the city, and then things got bad. The sources describe Sunni Ali as perpetrating terrible wickedness in Timbuktu. The scholarly class, which had flourished under Mali's patronage and which represented both the city's intellectual prestige and its accumulated wealth, was targeted. Scholars were killed. Others fled. The Sanhaja Berber population, which included many of the city's educated elite, evacuated to Walata, another trading city to the northwest. Why would Sunni Ali do this? Several factors seem to have been at play. First, there was a religious dimension. Sunni Ali was Muslim, but the sources suggest his practice was syncretistic, maintained traditional religious practices alongside Islam, which made the orthodox scholarly class view him with suspicion. The scholars, in turn, represented a power base that could challenge his authority. Eliminating or dispersing them removed a potential source of resistance. Second, there was simple greed. Scholars were wealthy, they owned libraries, property, trade, investments. Killing or exiling them meant their assets could be seized. This wasn't sophisticated governance, this was robbery with an army. Third, there may have been ethnic and political tensions between the Songhai leadership and the Berber scholarly elite of Timbuktu. The city had been founded by Tuareg Berbers and retained a significant Berber population among its educated class. Sunni Ali's conquest was as much an assertion of Songhai dominance over Berber, commercial, and intellectual networks as it was a military victory. Whatever the reasons, the consequences were immediate and severe. The scholarly purge created a brain drain. When your intellectuals flee, they take their knowledge, their teaching, their manuscripts, and their connections with them. Walata benefited from Timbuktu's loss, at least temporarily, but this also damaged Timbuktu's reputation. If you're a scholar considering where to study or teach, you're probably not going to choose the city where scholars were recently killed. The economic impact was equally serious. Gold traders, seeing the instability and fearing that their assets might be seized by Sunni Ali's forces, began diverting their caravans away from Timbuktu. Some of that trade shifted to Kano, a Hausa city-state in what's now northern Nigeria. Kano was further east, outside Songhai control, and therefore safer for merchants who didn't trust the new regime. This is how quickly commercial networks can shift. Merchants are risk-averse by nature. They have to be, because their entire livelihood depends on being able to move goods safely and predictably. When a city becomes unstable, trade routes adapt, often permanently. Timbuktu had benefited from centuries of trade flowing through it, but that flow wasn't guaranteed. It was conditional on political stability and security. Sunni Ali's violence disrupted that, and the city paid the price. But here's where it gets interesting. Sunni Ali didn't rule for very long after conquering Timbuktu, and his successors had different priorities. Sunni Ali died in 1492. His son briefly succeeded him, but was quickly overthrown in a coup by one of Sunni Ali's generals, Muhammad Turi, who took the title Askir Muhammad and founded the Askir dynasty. And the Askir dynasty, unlike Sunni Ali, understood that Timbuktu was more valuable as a functioning, intellectual, and commercial center than as a conquered territory to be exploited. Askir Muhammad stabilized the empire. He was a more orthodox Muslim, which improved his relationship with the scholarly class. He went on his own Hajj to Mecca in the late 1490s, following in Mansa Musa's footsteps and using the pilgrimage to establish his legitimacy and connections with the broader Islamic world. He reorganized the empire's administration, established a more systematic taxation system, and most importantly for Timbuktu, he stopped killing scholars. Under the Askir dynasty, Timbuktu recovered. The scholars returned. The city regained its autonomy, functioning as a semi-independent center within the larger Songhai Empire. Gao remained the administrative capital. That's where the emperor lived and where military power was concentrated, but Timbuktu retained its position as the intellectual and commercial hub. This arrangement actually worked well. Gao handled governance and military affairs. Timbuktu handled learning, trade, and cultural prestige. The division of labor allowed each city to specialize and prevented the kind of centralized control that might have stifled Timbuktu's intellectual independence. The trade recovered gold started flowing through Timbuktu again, though not at quite the same levels as before. Some of that trade had permanently shifted to alternative routes. But the city remained a major node in the Trans-Saharan system, trading gold and enslaved people from the south for Saharan salt and North African manufactured goods. The scholarly production intensified. This period from roughly 1500 to 1590 one is often described as Timbuktu's second golden age. The madrasas were full, scholars wrote prolifically, the manuscript collections grew. Ahmad Baba, who we talked about earlier, lived and worked during this period. The city became, once again, a destination for students and intellectuals from across the Islamic world. It's worth pausing to appreciate the resilience this demonstrates. Timbuktu suffered a catastrophic disruption under Sunni Ali scholars' Kilton. Population displaced, trade diverted, reputation damaged. And within a generation, the city had recovered and reached new heights of intellectual productivity. The decentralized system we talked about earlier, the independent scholar-led schools, the private manuscript collections, the embedded social structures, proved its value. The city could survive bad rulers because the knowledge infrastructure wasn't dependent on state patronage alone. But this golden age rested on a foundation that was more fragile than it appeared. The Songhai Empire was large and powerful, but it faced the same challenges every pre-modern empire faced: succession disputes, regional rebellions, military threats from neighbors, and the constant difficulty of maintaining control over vast distances with pre-modern communication and transportation technology. And there was a new factor that the Songhai leadership didn't fully appreciate. The technology gap was widening. European military technology, firearms, cannon, advanced metallurgy was developing rapidly. And some of that technology was spreading through North Africa via trade and conquest. The Songhai still fought primarily with traditional weapons, cavalry, infantry with swords and spears, archers. This worked fine against regional opponents who had similar military technology, but it wouldn't work against an enemy who brought guns. And across the Sahara, a Moroccan sultan was looking at the maps, calculating trade revenues, and thinking about gold. He had access to European military technology through trade with Spain and Portugal. He had mercenary soldiers willing to fight for pay, and he had ambitions that extended far beyond Morocco's borders. Timbuktu had rebuilt after Sunni Ali. The scholars had returned, the manuscripts had been preserved, the city had achieved a second golden age under Songhai protection. They had roughly 90 years to enjoy it before everything came crashing down again. This time, the threat wouldn't come from a regional rival with similar military capacity. It would come from across the Sahara, backed by European firearms and led by a commander who understood that technological advantage could overcome numerical superiority. Next time you complain about a difficult boss, remember, at least your boss probably isn't conducting a scholarly purge that causes a brain drain to a neighboring city-state. Sunni Ali set a very low bar for workplace management, but the Askia dynasty raised that bar and Timbuktu flourished again. Golden ages, though, have a way of ending just when everyone gets comfortable, and the Moroccan invasion was about to prove that firearms beat cavalry no matter how brave your soldiers are. The Songhai Empire controlled the gold trade, fielded massive armies, and dominated West Africa for over a century. Then a Moroccan sultan showed up with muskets and ended 500 years of Monde dominance in an afternoon. This is what happens when you bring traditional weapons to a gunpowder fight. The Battle of Tundibi in 1591 wasn't close. It wasn't a heroic last stand. It was a technological mismatch so severe that the outcome was essentially predetermined. The Songhai forces had numbers, experience, and home field advantage. The Moroccans had firearms, and firearms won. But let's back up and talk about why a Moroccan sultan decided to invade West Africa in the first place. Because this wasn't a random military adventure. This was calculated imperial strategy with very specific objectives. Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur ruled Morocco during the late 16th century, from 1578 to 1603. He'd come to power after defeating a Portuguese invasion at the Battle of Alcácer, victory that eliminated Portuguese territorial ambitions in Morocco and established al-Mansur as a serious military leader. But defeating an invasion is one thing. Building a sustainable power base is another. Al-Mansur had ambitions. He wanted to be recognized as a legitimate caliph, not just a regional sultan. He wanted to control the source of West African gold, which had been flowing north through the trans-Saharan trade for centuries, and he wanted to assert Moroccan dominance over the Sudanta West African savannas, a demonstration of his power and religious authority. The problem was that invading West Africa across the Sahara was logistically insane. The distance from Morocco to Timbuktu is roughly 1,500 miles of open desert. Supplying an army across that distance, maintaining discipline during months of marching through hostile terrain, and then conducting military operations at the end of that supply chain. This was not a plan most commanders would consider feasible, but al-Mansur had two advantages that made it possible. First, he had money. Morocco had benefited from its position as a Mediterranean trading power, and al-Mansur had access to tax revenues that allowed him to fund an expensive military expedition. He could afford to hire mercenaries, purchase supplies, and pay soldiers enough to convince them that crossing the Sahara was worth the risk. Second, and more importantly, he had access to European military technology. Through trade with Spain and Portugal and, ironically, through the same European powers that had tried to conquer Morocco, he could acquire firearms, cannons, and soldiers who knew how to use them effectively. The expedition that launched in 1590 was led by Judor Pasha, a commander of Spanish origin who'd converted to Islam and entered Moroccan service. The army included a significant number of Spanish and Portuguese mercenaries equipped with arquebuses and muskets, early firearms that were slow to reload but devastating against opponents without similar weapons. Estimates suggest the force included around 4,000 soldiers, which doesn't sound like much until you remember that several hundred of them had guns. The crossing of the Sahara took months. The army followed the established trade routes, using the same water sources and navigation techniques that merchant caravans had relied on for centuries. It was brutal. Soldiers died from heat, thirst, and disease. Supplies ran low, but the force arrived at the Niger Bend in early 1591, and word reached the Songhai capital of Jo that an invasion was underway. Askia Ishak II, the Songhai emperor, mobilized his forces. He assembled an army that vastly outnumbered the Moroccan invaders' sources, suggests somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 soldiers, including cavalry and infantry. The Songhai had every reason to be confident. They were defending their territory. They knew the terrain. They had overwhelming numerical superiority, and then they encountered the Moroccan firearms. The Battle of Tondibi took place on March 13, 1591, just north of Gao. The Songhai cavalry charged the Moroccan lines, which were standard military doctrine. Shock cavalry attacks had been effective in West African warfare for centuries. But cavalry charges work by creating psychological fear and physical disruption. They rely on the enemy breaking formation and fleeing. Musket volleys don't care about your psychological warfare. Muskets kill horses and riders at range before they can close for melee combat. The Moroccan forces held their positions, fired in disciplined volleys, and cut down the charging cavalry. The Songhai infantry couldn't effectively counter the firearms with traditional weapons. The battle turned into a slaughter. Askia Ishak II's forces broke and retreated. The Songhai Empire, which had dominated the region for over a century, collapsed as a political entity within ours. The emperor fled southeast, trying to regroup, but he'd lost his capital and his credibility. The Songhai would continue to exist as a regional power in reduced form, but they would never again control the Niger Bend or the Trans-Saharan trade system. 500 years of Mondian spy imperial dominance first. Mali, then Songhai ended at Tondibi because of a technology gap that the Songhai leadership hadn't adequately prepared for. The Moroccans occupied Timbuktu and the major cities of the Niger Bend. And this is where Sultan al-Mansir's grand plan started falling apart, because conquering a region and governing it are very different challenges. The immediate consequence for Timbuktu was devastating. The Moroccan forces occupied the city and immediately targeted the scholarly class again, because apparently every conqueror looked at Timbuktu's intellectuals and decided they were a threat. Ahmed Baba, the city's greatest scholar, was among those deported to Marrakesh, along with other prominent intellectuals. This was the second major scholarly purge Timbuktu had experienced in just over a century. Ahmed Baba spent 16 years in Morocco, imprisoned at first, later under house arrest. He continued writing because that's what Ahmed Baba didn't. Eventually returned to Timbuktu, where he kept working until his death in The man survived 2 empires collapsing and kept producing scholarship. Absolute legend, behavior, but the deportation of scholars damaged Timbuktu's intellectual reputation once again. And this time the damage was compounded by broader economic collapse. The trans-Saharan trade routes, which had sustained Timbuktu for centuries, were severely disrupted by the invasion. Merchants don't like war zones. They especially don't like war zones where military forces might confiscate their goods. Trade dried up. The routes that had been carefully maintained under Songhai protection fell into disrepair. Banditry increased. It took until 1620, nearly 30 years, for the trade to recover to anything approaching previous levels. And by then, the economic fundamentals had shifted. The Atlantic trade system was expanding. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and eventually English merchants were establishing direct maritime connections with West Africa's coast. They could buy gold, enslaved people, and other commodities directly from coastal populations, bypassing the trans-Saharan system entirely. Ships were faster than caravans. Sea routes were more flexible than desert crossings, and European demand was growing. The overland trade didn't disappear, it continued for centuries, but it was no longer the dominant system. The Moroccan invasion accelerated a transition that was probably inevitable, but it did so catastrophically, destroying the commercial infrastructure that had made Timbuktu wealthy. Sultan al-Mansur got his gold, at least temporarily. Moroccan forces extracted tribute and plunder from the occupied territories, but Morocco never established effective long-term control over the Sudan. The distance was too great. The logistics were too complex. The local population was too large and too hostile to be governed by a small occupying force. What emerged instead was a locally governed military oligarchy, the Arma, Pashalik made up of the descendants of the Moroccan soldiers who'd conquered the region. These soldiers intermarried with local populations, gradually became culturally distinct from Morocco, and by 1612 had effectively declared independence from Moroccan authority. Timbuktu became the administrative center of this new Arma state. But the Arma were a military caste, not empire builders. They controlled the cities, but couldn't project power effectively beyond them. They couldn't secure the trade routes. They couldn't maintain the kind of centralized governance that Mali and Songhai had provided. And they certainly couldn't recreate the intellectual patronage that had supported Timbuktu's golden ages. The Moroccan invasion represents a major inflection point in West African history. It demonstrated that European military technology, even wielded by proxy through Moroccan forces, could shatter traditional African power structures. It accelerated the decline of the overland trade system in favor of Atlantic maritime networks. And it permanently ended the era of large, centralized West African empires that had dominated the region since the 13th century. For Timbuktu specifically, the invasion meant the end of imperial patronage, the loss of trade security, the exile of its intellectual leadership, and the beginning of a long decline from which the city would never fully recover. The scholars eventually returned. Ahmad Baba came back and kept writing. Families preserved their manuscripts. The madrasas continued operating at reduced capacity, but Timbuktu would never again be the thriving intellectual and commercial capital it had been under Mali and Songhai protection. Strong central rule in the Niger Bend was gone, fragmented into competing local powers, military factions, and desert tribal groups reasserting control. The conditions that had allowed Timbuktu to flourish, political stability, trade, security, imperial investment, had evaporated. What replaced them was chronic instability, economic stagnation, and 2 centuries of political chaos. Next time someone tells you technology doesn't matter, remind them that muskets ended a 100-year empire in an afternoon. The Songhai were brave, they were numerous, they were experienced, and they lost because they brought swords to a gunfight. But military defeat, as catastrophic as it was, only destroyed the empire. The real damage to Timbuktu came from what happened next. 2 centuries of a dysfunctional military oligarchy that couldn't govern, couldn't maintain order, and couldn't stop the factions from tearing the city apart from the inside. Between 1671 and 1750, Timbuktu experienced 114 regime changes. That's roughly 1.4 coups per year. The average reign of a Pashatha local ruler was 11 months. If you were governing Timbuktu during this period, you had better odds of dying violently than of dying of old age. This is not a functional government. This is barely even a government. This is a military oligarchy eating itself while the city it supposedly controls descends into economic chaos, hyperinflation, and irrelevance. The Moroccan invasion destroyed the Songhai Empire. What it created in its place was somehow worse a system so unstable, so consumed by internal factionalism, so utterly incapable of basic governance that it makes Sunni Ali's scholarly purge look restrained by comparison. At least Sunni Ali had a plan, even if it was a terrible one. The Arma Pashalik didn't even have that. Let's talk about how this disaster unfolded, because it's instructive. This is what happens when military conquest isn't followed by actual institutional building. The Moroccan soldiers who conquered the Niger Bend in 1591 didn't go home. Most of them couldn't. Crossing the Sahara back to Morocco was expensive, dangerous, and Morocco wasn't particularly interested in paying for their return, so they stayed. They intermarried with local populations, they had children, and over time they evolved into a distinct ruling caste called the Arma Mixed Descent Group that was no longer Moroccan but wasn't fully integrated into local society either. Timbuktu became the administrative center of their territory, which they called the Pashalik. By 1612, just 21 years after the invasion, the Arma had effectively declared independence from Morocco. The Sultan in Marrakesh had lost control. The Arma were on their own, and they immediately proved they had no idea how to govern. The Arma system was based on military power, not administrative competence. The Pasha, the ruler, was selected from among the military elite, and the position was supposed to rotate among the leading families. In theory, this would prevent any single faction from dominating. In practice, it meant constant power struggles, assassinations, and coups as different factions fought for control. The numbers are almost comical if they weren't so tragic. 114 regime changes in 79 years. Do the math. That's an average of 11 months per ruler. Some pashas lasted years. Others lasted weeks. One particularly unfortunate individual apparently lasted less than a month before being overthrown and executed. Imagine trying to implement any kind of policy, any kind of long-term planning, when your government turns over more than once a year. You can't build infrastructure. You can't negotiate treaties. You can't invest in education or commerce. You can't even collect taxes efficiently because by the time you've set up a system, you've been overthrown and the next guy changes everything. This wasn't governance. This was armed chaos with a title. The economic consequences were catastrophic. The trans-Saharan trade, which was already struggling after the Moroccan invasion, required political stability to function. Merchants needed to know that routes were secure, that contracts would be enforced, that their goods wouldn't be arbitrarily confiscated by whichever warlord happened to control the city that month. The armor couldn't provide that security. They were too busy fighting each other. Trade declined. Caravans diverted to more stable routes. The merchants who remained in Timbuktu faced increasingly desperate extraction attempts by pashas, who needed money to pay soldiers, and by loyalty. This created a vicious cycle. Political instability drove away commerce, which reduced tax revenue, which made pashas more desperate, which increased instability. And then came the hyperinflation. The sources describe a period where the price of Milathar staple grain increased by a factor of 1,000 in just a few years. 1,000. That's not inflation, that's economic apocalypse. When your basic food costs 1,000 times what it did a few years ago, your society is in free fall. This likely resulted from a combination of factors: disrupted agriculture due to warfare, breakdown of trade networks that brought food from surrounding regions, currency debasement as desperate rulers tried to finance their wars, and possibly drought or climate stress that reduced harvests. Whatever the causes, the result was famine, social chaos, and mass suffering. The Armor government, such as it was, proved completely incapable of responding. They were too fragmented, too focused on internal power struggles, too lacking in administrative capacity to organize famine, relief, or stabilize food supplies. People starved while the military elite fought over who got to call themselves Pasha. And here's the thing that really demonstrates the Armor's failure. They couldn't even maintain military control over their own territory. The Pashalik was supposed to control the Niger Bend and the surrounding regions. But by the mid-18th century, the Armor were paying tribute to more powerful groups. The Tuareg, the same nomadic Berber peoples who'd founded Timbuktu 600 years earlier, reasserted control over the desert trade routes and the critical salt supplies from Tagaza. The Kunta, an Arabized Berber confederation, became the real power brokers in the region, managing commerce while the Armor squabbled over titles. In 1770, the Tuareg laid siege to Timbuktu. The city held out, but the fact that it was even besieged demonstrates how weak the Armor had become. You're supposed to be the government. You're not supposed to need to defend your own capital from groups that should theoretically be your subjects. In 1790, the Bambara powerful group from the south briefly seized Timbuktu. The Armor couldn't stop them. The occupation was short, but it was another humiliation, another demonstration that the Pashalik had lost control. By the late 18th century, the Armor Pashalik had faded into irrelevance. They still existed. Nominally, there were still pashas being selected and overthrown, but they controlled almost nothing beyond Timbuktu itself, and even that control was contested. The system had become a historical curiosity, a zombie government that refused to officially die but had ceased to matter. Compare this to the Songhai Empire the Armor had replaced. Songhai had governed effectively for over a century. They'd maintained trade security, administered justice through Islamic law, collected taxes systematically, and patronized intellectual life. They'd built an empire. The Arma built nothing. They inherited a conquered territory and proceeded to run it into the ground through factional violence and administrative incompetence. The contrast is stark, and here's what's particularly frustrating from a historical perspective. The initial Moroccan conquest, while destructive, wasn't necessarily fatal to Timbuktu's prosperity. If the Arma had established stable governance, maintained trade security, and invested in the city's infrastructure and intellectual institutions, Timbuktu could have recovered. The manuscripts were still there. The scholarly families were still there. The geographic advantages that had made the city important hadn't changed. But you can't build anything on a foundation of 11-month governments and constant coups. The Arma's chronic instability destroyed more wealth, killed more people, and caused more long-term damage than the actual invasion that brought them to power. This is the paradox of conquest. Sometimes the violence of the initial takeover is less destructive than the incompetent governance that follows. The scholarly class in Timbuktu survived this period, barely. Families continued preserving manuscripts. Madrasas kept operating at minimal capacity. Scholars still taught students, wrote commentaries, and maintained intellectual networks. But they did so despite the government, not because of it. There was no imperial patronage. There was no state investment in education. The intellectual life of the city continued purely through private initiative and family commitment. This is actually a testament to the resilience of Timbuktu's decentralized knowledge system. The Arma couldn't destroy what they didn't control. The manuscripts stayed in private households. The teaching happened in homes and mosque courtyards. The scholarly networks operated through personal relationships that transcended political chaos. But resilience isn't the same as flourishing. Timbuktu survived the Arma period, but it survived diminished, impoverished, and marginal. The city that had once attracted scholars from across the Islamic world was reduced to a regional center struggling with basic security and food supplies. By the time the Arma system finally collapsed in the late 18th century, Timbuktu had experienced nearly 200 years of political fragmentation and economic decline. The trans-Saharan trade continued, but at reduced levels and through alternative routes. The intellectual reputation remained, but based on past glory rather than current achievement. And yet, in Europe, the myth of Timbuktu was stronger than ever. Europeans had never stopped hearing about the legendary city of gold. The accounts of Mansa Musa's wealth, Leo Africanus's 16th century descriptions, and ongoing reports from North African merchants had kept Timbuktu in the European imagination. The city had become synonymous with remote, inaccessible, exotic, wealthy, and African El Dorado, waiting to be discovered. The fact that the actual city was impoverished, politically chaotic, and economically marginal didn't matter. Europeans didn't know that. They just knew that somewhere in the African interior was a legendary city, and finding it had become an obsession. Next time you complain about government dysfunction, remember, at least your government probably lasts longer than 11 months between coups. The Arma set a very low bar, and somehow they still tripped over it. But European explorers didn't care about Arma dysfunction. They cared about finding Timbuktu, claiming the glory of reaching it, and hopefully discovering that the gold rumors were true. Spoiler, the explorers were in for a massive disappointment. In 1828, René Cayley became the first European to reach Timbuktu and return alive. He won 9,000 francs from the Geographical Society of Paris, an eternal fame. He also discovered that Timbuktu was nothing like the legend, and absolutely nobody wanted to hear it. This is the problem with hype. When you spend 500 years building a myth about a city lined with gold, streets paved with precious metals, and palaces dripping with wealth, the actual sandy, impoverished trading post is going to be a disappointment. Cayley showed up expecting an African El Dorado and found mud brick buildings, struggling markets, and a level of poverty that must have been absolutely soul-crushing after months of dangerous travel. But Europe wasn't ready to let go of the fantasy, because the myths of Timbuktu had never really been about Timbuktu. It had been about European imagination, colonial ambition, and the deep-seated need to believe that somewhere in the African interior was treasure waiting to be claimed. Let's talk about how that myth got so out of control in the first place. The European obsession with Timbuktu started, as most things do, with Mansa Musa's flex in 1324. When a West African king crashes the Mediterranean economy by giving away too much gold, people remember. The story spread through North African and Middle Eastern trade networks, eventually reaching European merchants and cartographers who'd never set foot in West Africa but were very interested in where all that gold came from. The Catalan Atlas of 1374 depicted Mansa Musa holding a massive gold nugget, with Timbuktu labelled on the map. This wasn't based on first-hand observation. This was based on rumours, merchant reports, and a lot of wishful thinking. But maps have authority. Once something appears on a map, it becomes known, even if nobody actually knows it. Then came Leo Africanus, and Leo Africanus made everything worse. Leo Africanus, born Al-Hazon ibn Muhammad al-Wazan. Al-Fassi was a Moroccan diplomat and traveller who visited Timbuktu sometime around 1510 to 1513. During the late Askir period, when the city was actually thriving, he later ended up in Italy, converted to Christianity, and wrote a geographical description of Africa that was published in 1550. His account of Timbuktu was glowing. He described a wealthy city with abundant grain supplies, numerous scholars, a thriving book trade, and a king so rich his golden scepter weighed 1,300 pounds. Some of this was probably accurate. He did visit during a golden age. Some of it was definitely exaggerated. The 1,300-pound scepter seems unlikely. And all of it was filtered through a European lens that emphasized the exotic and the wealthy, because that's what European readers wanted. Leo Africanus's description became the standard European reference for Timbuktu for the next 3 centuries. Never mind that he'd visited during the Askir dynasty's peak, and that the city had since endured the Moroccan invasion. 200 years of armed chaos and complete economic collapse. Europeans read his account and assumed that's what Timbuktu was still like. The myth calcified. By the 18th century, Timbuktu had become shorthand in European literature for remote, exotic, inaccessible wealth. It appeared in poems, in adventure novels, in geographical treatises. It was the ultimate challenge for explorers of cities so remote that reaching it alive would prove your credentials as an adventurer, and finding it would supposedly unlock access to African riches. The problem was that nobody could reach it. More accurately, the Europeans who tried kept dying. The obstacles were significant. First, you had to cross the Sahara, which required local guides, camels, navigation skills, and a tolerance for heat and thirst that most Europeans lacked. Second, you had to deal with the fact that the region was predominantly Muslim and Europeans were predominantly Christian, which created religious and cultural barriers that could turn deadly. Third, you had to avoid being robbed, murdered, or enslaved by any number of groups who had no particular reason to welcome strange foreigners, asking suspicious questions about gold. But the geographical societies of Europe were obsessed. They offered prizes for anyone who could reach Timbuktu and return with accurate information. The French Geographical Society offered 10,000 francs, a massive sum. The British Royal Geographical Society offered similar rewards. This was the 18th and 19th century equivalent of the space race. Except, instead of going to the moon, you were trying to reach a city that was theoretically mappable but practically unreachable. The Europeans particularly wanted to solve the Niger question, figuring out where the Niger River flowed, which direction it went, and how it connected to the geography of the interior. This wasn't pure scientific curiosity. This was commercial and colonial reconnaissance. If you could map the Niger, you could figure out trade routes, identify potential ports, and plan future invasions. Geography is never politically neutral. Mungo Park, a Scottish explorer, made 2 attempts to explore the Niger in the 1790s and 1800s. His first expedition, from 1795 to 1797, reached the Niger and confirmed it flowed eastward, which was useful information. His second expedition, in 1805, ended with his death. He drowned trying to escape an attack in what's now Nigeria. Park never reached Timbuktu, but his accounts fed the European fascination with the region. Then came Alexander Gordon Lang, a British army officer who attempted to reach Timbuktu from the north, crossing the Sahara from Tripoli in 1825. He made it. He actually reached Timbuktu on August 13th, 1826, becoming the first known European to arrive. And then he was murdered shortly after leaving the city on his return journey. Lang's death meant that while he technically won the race to reach Timbuktu, he couldn't collect the prize, couldn't publish his account, and couldn't tell Europe what he'd found. His letters, sent from Timbuktu before his departure, were brief and didn't provide the kind of detailed description the geographical societies wanted. So the mystery remained. Enter René Cayley, and René Cayley took a very different approach. Cayley was French, working class, and obsessed with African exploration. He'd travelled in West Africa previously, learned some Arabic, and understood that the previous European attempts had failed because they were too obviously European. Europeans travelling with large expeditions, armed guards, and official backing attracted attention and suspicion. Cayley decided to travel in disguise. He posed as an Egyptian Muslim returning home from West Africa. He adopted Muslim dress, claimed to have been captured by the French as a child and raised in Egypt, and said he was making his way back to Cairo. This cover story allowed him to join trading caravans and move through the region without attracting the suspicion that had doomed previous expeditions. It worked. Cayley reached Timbuktu on April 20th, 1828, and stayed for 2 weeks. He observed the city, took notes, and then joined a caravan heading north across the Sahara to Morocco. He made it back to France, alive in September 1828, and published his account in 1830. And Europeans were devastated by what he reported. Cayley's description of Timbuktu was brutally honest, The city, he wrote, was greatly disappointed to his expectations. It was impoverished, the buildings were made of mud brick, not gold. The markets were struggling. The population had declined. There was no visible wealth. The legendary city of gold was a dusty, ordinary trading post that had clearly seen better days. Quote, I had formed a totally different idea of the grandeur and wealth of Timbuktu. The city presented, at first view, nothing but a mass of ill-looking houses built of earth. He described his feelings as painful surprise and said the city offered nothing like what I had so long dreamt. The Geographical Society of Paris awarded him the 9,000 francs, 1,000 francs, less than the original prize. Apparently, and the larger European reaction was skepticism. Many people simply didn't believe him. After centuries of hearing about Timbuktu's wealth, his account of poverty didn't fit the narrative. Some accused him of lying or exaggerating the city's decline. Others suggested he'd visited the wrong city. But Cayley was right. He had visited Timbuktu in 1828. Nearly 40 years after the Bambara had briefly occupied it, and 2 centuries into the armored decline. The city was poor because the trade routes had shifted. The political system had collapsed, and the imperial patronage that had sustained its golden ages was long gone. What Cayley saw was the reality of post-imperial decline, the archaeological remains of a formerly great city struggling to survive in changed circumstances. The problem wasn't Cayley's account. The problem was that the myth had become more powerful than reality. Think about this from a European perspective. For 500 years, you've heard stories about an African city so wealthy that its king casually gives away gold bars. You've read Leo Africanus describing abundant riches. You've seen maps depicting Timbuktu as a major center of civilization. And now some French guy shows up and says it's actually just poor and sandy. That's disappointing. That's anticlimactic. That ruins the fantasy. So Europe did what Europe always does when faced with inconvenient facts. It ignored them and kept believing the myth. The legend of Timbuktu persisted throughout the 19th century, despite Cayley's account. Adventure novels still featured it as an exotic prize. Colonial planners still discussed it as a strategic target. Explorers continued attempting to reach it, motivated by the same mixture of curiosity, ambition, and colonial reconnaissance that had driven the earlier expeditions. Part of this persistence was simple denial, but part of it was strategic. The myth of Timbuktu was useful for justifying colonial expansion. If Europeans believed Africa contained wealthy cities and abundant resources that justified conquest, the idea that Timbuktu was impoverished and marginal was less useful for colonial propaganda than the idea that it was a treasure vault waiting to be civilized. The other European expeditions that followed Cayley's journey continued the pattern. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer, reached Timbuktu in 1853 and stayed for several months, producing detailed scholarly accounts of the city's history and culture. His work was valuable for European understanding of the region, but it also confirmed what Cayley had reported. Timbuktu was not the legendary city of gold. It was an ordinary, struggling trading post with a remarkable past. And yet the myth endured, because myths serve purposes beyond truth. The myth of Timbuktu justified exploration, which provided intelligence for colonization, which enabled the scramble for Africa that would dominate the late 19th century. Here's the ironic part. Timbuktu was actually valuable just not in the way Europeans imagined. The city's real treasure had always been its intellectual capital, the manuscripts, the scholarly traditions, the educational infrastructure. But Europeans in the 19th century weren't particularly interested in African scholarship. The colonial ideology of the era assumed African intellectual inferiority. So when they looked at Timbuktu, they saw what they expected: poverty and decline. They completely missed the hundreds of thousands of manuscripts documenting centuries of sophisticated African scholarship. They overlooked the families still preserving texts, the scholars still teaching, the madrasas still operating. They saw the physical decay, but not the intellectual persistence. This blindness would have consequences, because while European explorers were busy being disappointed that Timbuktu wasn't lined with gold, European colonial powers were planning actual invasions, and when the French finally arrived with military force in the 1890s, they would prove just as incapable of recognizing Timbuktu's real value as the explorers who preceded them. The European expedition to disappointment taught an important lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous myths are the ones that persist despite evidence. Cayley told Europe the truth about Timbuktu. He described what he saw accurately, and Europe responded by continuing to believe the legend, because the legend was more useful than reality. The city that Europeans fantasized about never existed. The city that actually existed, a real place with real history and real intellectual achievements, was invisible to them. They came looking for gold and left disappointed, never realizing that the treasure was there all along, carefully preserved in wooden trunks and passed down through generations of families who understood that knowledge outlasts empires. Next time someone tells you to never meet your heroes, remember, Timbuktu was Europe's hero for 500 years. And when they finally met, Europe was so disappointed they decided to invade anyway. Because if your fantasy doesn't match reality, obviously reality is the problem. But disappointment doesn't stop empires. It just changes the justification. And the French were about to prove that you don't need gold to make colonization profitable. You just need administrative control, resource extraction, and a willingness to ignore everything that made a place valuable in the first place. The French invaded Timbuktu in December 1893, fought their way past local resistance, and immediately decided the city wasn't worth the trouble. Then they spent the next 70 years proving it. This is colonial logic at its finest. Conquer a place because you've spent centuries obsessing over it. Realize it doesn't have the resources you imagined, and then systematically neglect it while wondering why it keeps getting worse. The French didn't destroy Timbuktu with violence, though there was plenty of that. They destroyed it with bureaucratic indifference, infrastructure, prioritization that excluded the entire northern region, and administrative policies that turned the city from a neglected periphery into a permanent economic liability. Welcome to French Sudan, where all the investment goes south and Timbuktu gets sand. Let's start with the actual invasion, because it's important to understand that the French didn't just waltz into Timbuktu unopposed. There was serious resistance, and the fact that the French eventually won doesn't diminish the reality that local forces fought back hard. By the 1890s, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. European powers were carving up the continent, drawing borders, claiming territories, and competing with each other for colonial possessions. France wanted to establish a continuous belt of territory across West Africa, connecting their coastal colonies to the interior. Timbuktu, sitting at the Niger Bend, was strategically positioned along that belt. The French had been gradually expanding their control over the Senegal River Valley and pushing eastward throughout the 1880s. They'd defeated various African kingdoms and established military posts across the region. By 1893, they were ready to move on Timbuktu. A French column under Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Joffre, would later become famous as a World War I general, approached the city in December 1893. They encountered strong resistance from local forces, including Tuareg warriors who understood exactly what French occupation would mean for their autonomy and their control over desert trade routes. The fighting was intense. The French had superior firearms by this point, repeating rifles and machine guns, but the local forces had knowledge of the terrain, defensive positions, and a desperate motivation to keep foreign invaders out. The French eventually prevailed through technological advantage and numerical superiority, occupying Timbuktu on December 28, 1893. And then they looked around and thought, we crossed a desert for this. Because Cayley had been right. Timbuktu in 1893 was poor, declining, and marginal. The trans-Saharan trade was a shadow of its former self-Atlantic maritime trade, had won that competition decades earlier. The city's population had shrunk. The infrastructure was crumbling. The intellectual life that had once made it famous was operating at minimal capacity. The French had spent resources conquering a city that had almost no immediate economic value. The gold mines were far to the south, in regions the French already controlled or would soon control. The salt trade was controlled by desert peoples who were going to resist French authority regardless of who held Timbuktu. The city itself produced almost nothing. So the French made a decision that would shape Timbuktu's fate for the next century. They decided to ignore it. French Sudan, the colonial territory that encompassed most of what's now Mali, needed an administrative capital. The French chose Bamako, a city on the Niger River far to the south, closer to the coast, more accessible to French supply lines, and positioned in agricultural regions that could actually generate colonial revenue. This wasn't an arbitrary choice. From a colonial logistics perspective, Bamako made sense. It was easier to supply. It was in a more productive agricultural zone. It was closer to the railroad that would eventually connect the interior to the coast. Bamako was the practical choice for administrators who cared about revenue extraction and administrative efficiency. But this choice had enormous consequences for regional development. Colonial development policy overwhelmingly favored the South. Roads, schools, hospitals, agricultural development programs, infrastructure investment, all of it went to the regions around Bamako and the southern agricultural zones. These were the areas that could grow peanuts for export, cotton for French textile mills, and other cash crops that generated colonial revenue. The North got almost nothing. Timbuktu and the surrounding Sahel regions were viewed as unproductive, difficult to govern, and not worth significant investment. The French maintained a military presence to project authority and suppress resistance, but they didn't build roads. They didn't invest in schools. They didn't develop infrastructure. They didn't create employment opportunities. This policy created a structural economic divide that persists to this day. Southern Mali became relatively more developed, with better infrastructure, more educational opportunities, and stronger integration into the cash economy. Northern Mali remained marginal, underdeveloped, and economically isolated. For Timbuktu specifically, this meant economic stagnation. The trans-Saharan trade, which had sustained the city for centuries, continued declining as Atlantic maritime routes became more efficient and as French colonial policy deliberately redirected trade flows toward the coast. The caravan routes still existed, but they carried less volume and generated less wealth. The French didn't need Timbuktu to be a major trading center. They needed the interior's resources to flow to the coast for export to France. Timbuktu's historical role as a breakbulk point between the Sahara and the Niger River was irrelevant to that model. So the city's economic function withered through deliberate neglect. The intellectual infrastructure suffered similarly. The French colonial administration had minimal interest in Islamic education or local scholarly traditions. They established French-language schools in some southern cities to train colonial administrators. But they didn't invest in Timbuktu's madrasas or support the manuscript collections. The scholarly families continued preserving texts and teaching students, but without patronage, without infrastructure investment, and without integration into the colonial system that was reshaping the region. This created a paradox. Timbuktu remained symbolically important, was still the legendary city that European explorers had obsessed over, but it was practically irrelevant to French colonial governance. The myth persisted while the reality continued deteriorating. And then there was the resistance. The Tuareg, who had founded Timbuktu and who had maintained significant autonomy in the Sahara for centuries, did not accept French occupation peacefully. They had no intention of submitting to colonial authority, paying taxes to foreign administrators, or allowing the French to control the desert trade routes that were central to their economy and way of life. The early colonial period saw repeated Tuareg revolts against French rule. These weren't coordinated independence movements. The Tuareg were organized in tribal confederations, not centralized states, but they were persistent resistance efforts aimed at driving out French forces and maintaining autonomy. Two major revolts stand out: the Furhound Revolt and the Kosanag-Keita Revolt, both occurring during and shortly after World War I, from 1914 to 1917. Furhound Ag Alinsa was a Tuareg leader who organized resistance in the Kaidal and Gao regions, challenging French military outposts and disrupting colonial administration. The revolt was motivated by French taxation policies, forced labor demands, and military conscription. The French were trying to recruit African soldiers for World War I, and the Tuareg were not interested in dying in European trenches for their colonizers. Kosanag-Keita led a parallel revolt in the Timbuktu region. The resistance included raids on French positions, attacks on colonial supply lines, and attempts to drive French forces out of the desert zones entirely. The French response was brutal. Colonial military doctrine at the time emphasized overwhelming force and collective punishment. Villages suspected of supporting rebels were burned. Livestock was seized or killed. Wells were poisoned, particularly devastating tactic in a desert environment where water sources are life or death. Infrastructure. French forces conducted punitive expeditions into the desert, hunting down resistance fighters and executing captured rebels. By 1917, the revolts had been suppressed through military force and environmental warfare that devastated pastoral communities. The Tuareg were not defeated in the sense of accepting. French authority, they remained hostile and resistant, but they were militarily overwhelmed and unable to continue organized resistance. These revolts established a pattern that would repeat throughout the 20th century. Northern populations, particularly Tuareg and Arab communities, resisting southern-based central authority, and that authority responding with military force rather than political accommodation. The French never successfully integrated the North into their colonial system. They controlled it militarily, but they didn't govern it effectively. They couldn't. The distances were too vast, the population too mobile, the environment too hostile, and the resistance too persistent. So they focused on the South, extracted what resources they could, and treated the North as a security problem rather than a development opportunity. For Timbuktu, this meant 70 years of colonial rule that brought no meaningful benefits and significant costs. The city's traditional economic functions were undermined by colonial trade policy. Its intellectual traditions were ignored by French administrators who viewed Islamic education as backward. Its infrastructure deteriorated without investment, and its population endured the same taxation, forced labor, and military violence that characterized French colonialism across West Africa. The trans-Saharan trade didn't disappear entirely during the colonial period, but it became increasingly marginal. The transportation revolution, railroads, automobiles, eventually aircraft made Saharan caravans economically obsolete for most goods. The route still carried some traditional trade, particularly salt from the northern mines to southern markets, but the volume and economic importance were vastly reduced from the Golden Age centuries. By the 1950s, as decolonization movements spread across Africa, Timbuktu was economically stagnant, infrastructurally neglected, and administratively marginalized. The city had survived centuries of imperial cycles, invasions, and political chaos. But French colonial policy, through systematic neglect and deliberate underdevelopment of the North, had done damage that conquest alone never achieved. And here's the tragic part. This marginalization wasn't reversed by independence. When Mali gained independence from France in 1960, the new government was dominated by southern elites who had been educated in French schools, who spoke French, who had been integrated into the colonial administrative system. They inherited the colonial capital in Bamako. They inherited the colonial economic model that prioritized the South, and they inherited the colonial attitude that the North was a problem to be managed rather than a region to be developed. The French left in 1960. The development priorities they'd established stayed. The North-South divide they'd created stayed. The marginalization of Timbuktu stayed. Independence was supposed to be liberation. For Timbuktu and the northern regions, it was just a changing of administrators while the fundamental problems persisted. Same economic neglect, same infrastructure deficit, same political marginalization, just with a different flag and a different language spoken in the capital. Next time someone romanticizes colonial exploration and the discovery of African cities, remember, the French spent centuries obsessing over Timbuktu, finally invaded it, and then immediately started ignoring it. They built roads in the south, schools in the south, hospitals in the south, and left the north to deteriorate. Conquest without investment is just organized theft with paperwork. But at least under colonialism, there was a distant foreign power to blame for the neglect. After 1960, The neglect came from Bamako, from fellow Malians who spoke different languages, came from different regions, and had different priorities. And that made the resentment so much worse. Because when your own government abandons you, when independence doesn't bring development, when decades pass and nothing improves, eventually you stop asking nicely. Eventually you pick up weapons. And the North had been preparing for that conversation since the French first arrived. Mali became independent in 1960. Within 2 years, the North was in open rebellion. Within 2 decades, the desert was winning, and nobody in Bamako seemed particularly interested in stopping either. This is the part of the story where all the structural problems, colonial neglect, regional marginalization, ethnic tensions, infrastructure deficits collide with environmental catastrophe and explode into decades of violence. Because when you systematically exclude entire populations from political power, deny them economic development, and then the climate decides to make their traditional livelihoods impossible, you don't get peaceful accommodation. You get rebellion. Repeatedly. Welcome to post-independence Mali, where the government in Bamako inherited all of France's worst policies and decided to keep them, and where the Sahara decided to expand southward just to make everything worse. Let's start with what independence actually meant for northern Mali, because independence is one of those words that sounds great until you examine who actually benefits from it. Mali gained independence on September 22, 1960. The new government was led by Modibo Keïta, a socialist-leaning leader who'd been part of the anti-colonial movement. The capital remained in Bamako. The administrative structure remained centralized in the south. The new political elite were overwhelmingly from southern ethnic groups, Bambara, Malink, others who had been educated in French schools and integrated into colonial administration. The north home to Tuareg Moor, Songhai, and other populations was barely represented in the new government. The power structure that had marginalized them under French rule continued marginalizing them under Malian rule. Same dynamic, different flag. The northern populations had expected that independence would bring regional autonomy, investment in their territories, and political representation proportional to their populations. What they got was a government in Bamako that viewed them with the same mixture of suspicion and indifference that the French had. The first Tuareg rebellion started in 1962. 2 years after independence. That's not a coincidence. That's a direct response to the realization that independence hadn't changed anything for the North. The rebellion was led by various Tuareg groups who called themselves the Alfalaga Bandits, or rebels in Arabic. Though obviously they didn't view themselves that way. Their demands were straightforward: either genuine autonomy for the northern regions, or outright separation and the creation of an independent Tuareg state. The Malian government's response was immediate and brutal. Rather than negotiate, rather than address the underlying grievances about marginalization and underdevelopment, the government deployed the military. And the military didn't just fight armed rebels, they targeted the entire pastoral economy that sustained Tuareg communities. Government forces destroyed livestock. They poisoned wells, the same tactic the French had used during the colonial revolts. They bombed nomadic encampments. They arrested suspected rebel sympathizers, often with minimal evidence, and subjected them to torture and imprisonment. The goal wasn't just to defeat the armed rebellion. The goal was to break the Tuareg as a people, to force them into sedentary lifestyles, to eliminate their traditional autonomy. This is counterinsurgency at its most destructive, collective punishment aimed at the entire population, not just combatants. The results were predictable and catastrophic. Thousands of Tuareg fled Mali entirely, seeking refuge in neighboring countries Algeria, Libya, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso. These weren't just young fighters escaping military pressure. These were entire families, complete communities, abandoning their traditional territories because staying meant starvation, violence, or forced sedentism under a hostile government. The mass exodus created a Tuareg diaspora that would have long-term consequences. The refugees who fled to Libya in the 1960s and 70s would later be recruited into Muammar Gaddafi's military and security forces. When Gaddafi's regime eventually collapsed in 2011, those fighters battle-hardened, well-armed, and still angry about their treatment in Mollywood return home and trigger the 2012 crisis. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The first rebellion was eventually suppressed by the late 1960s through a combination of military force and sheer exhaustion. The Tuareg couldn't sustain armed resistance without external support, and no neighboring countries were willing to provide it. The rebellion faded, but the grievances didn't. They just went underground, waiting for the next crisis. And the next crisis was already developing. It just wasn't political, it was environmental. Starting in the late 1960s and continuing through the 1970s and 80s, the Sahel experienced severe, recurring droughts. These weren't normal dry seasons. These were multi-year periods where rainfall dropped dramatically. Water sources dried up, vegetation died, and the desert advanced southward. The Sahel, the transitional zone between the Sahara and the more humid Sahara, depends on a delicate balance of rainfall to sustain its grasslands and support pastoral economies. When that rainfall fails consistently, the ecosystem collapses, and in the late 20th century, it failed repeatedly. The 1970s drought was particularly catastrophic. Rainfall across the Sahel dropped by 20 to 40% compared to historical averages. The Niger River, which had sustained Timbuktu and the surrounding regions for a millennium, saw its levels plummet. Lake Fagabine, north of Timbuktu, which had been a major source of fish and water for surrounding communities, dried up almost entirely. It hasn't recovered. For pastoral communities, the Tuareg Fulani, and others whose entire economies were based on moving livestock to seasonal grazing areas, the drought was apocalyptic. The grass died, the wells dried up, the livestock starved. Entire herds that represented generations of accumulated wealth died within months. Imagine your entire economic system, everything your family has built over centuries, disappearing because it stopped raining. That's what happened. The pastoral economy of the Sahel collapsed. The humanitarian consequences were staggering. Famine spread across the region. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people died across the Sahel during the 1970s drought, starvation, disease, malnutrition-related deaths. Millions more were displaced, forced to abandon their traditional territories and migrate to urban areas or refugee camps where they became dependent on international food aid. Timbuktu, which had always existed on the edge of viability, was hit hard. The city's population had traditionally been supported by a combination of river agriculture, regional trade, and exchange with pastoral communities. When the pastoral economy collapsed and the river levels dropped, the city's already fragile economy deteriorated further. International aid organizations responded with emergency relief. UNICEF and other groups established water point wells equipped with pumps to provide drinking water to communities whose traditional sources had dried up. This saved lives. But it also had an unintended consequence. It forced nomadic populations to settle around those water points. If you're a pastoralist and your traditional wells have dried up, but there's a UNICEF well that provides reliable water, you have to stay near that well. You can't maintain your traditional nomadic patterns because moving means leaving your only water source. So communities that had been mobile for centuries became sedentary, concentrated around aid-provided infrastructure. This sedentism, the forced transition from nomadic to settled lifestyles, fundamentally transformed northern Malian society. The Tuareg had founded Timbuktu as a seasonal camp for nomads. Now their descendants were being forced to abandon nomadism entirely, not by government policy, but by environmental collapse that made mobility impossible. And sedentary populations are easier to control, easier to tax, and easier to marginalize. The Malian government hadn't managed to force the Tuareg into settlement through military means. Climate change did it for them. But settled, impoverished, and resentful populations are also more likely to rebel. Because when you're stuck in one place, watching your traditional economy die, dependent on international aid, and still being ignored by a government that won't invest in your region, you have time to organize. You have time to remember the grievances. You have time to plan. The 1980s brought more drought, more famine, more displacement, and more international aid, which created more dependency. The Malian government, for its part, did almost nothing to address the underlying crises. Development funds that could have been used for drought relief, for well construction, for agricultural support, were instead diverted to military equipment and urban development in the south. This wasn't just neglect. This was active policy choice. The government prioritized military spending over development spending. Even as the North was experiencing humanitarian catastrophe, the message was clear. The North wasn't worth investing in, but it was worth controlling militarily. By the late 1980s, conditions were perfect for another rebellion. The environmental crisis had destroyed traditional livelihoods. The government had failed to provide meaningful support. The diaspora communities in Libya and elsewhere were growing increasingly militant, and a new generation of young Tuareg men born into displacement, raised on stories of government oppression and trained in Gaddafi's military camps were preparing to return home. The Second Tuareg Rebellion started in 1990. The immediate trigger was a minor incidental confrontation between Tuareg, travelers, and government officials in the town of Menaka. But the underlying causes had been building for 30 years. This rebellion was better organized, better armed, and more explicitly political than the first. The rebels formed organized movements with clear demands: genuine autonomy for the northern regions, proportional political representation, economic development, investment, and cultural rights for Tuareg and Arab populations. Some factions demanded full independence and the creation of a separate state called Azawad the Tuareg, name for the northern regions. The Malian government's response followed the same pattern as before: military force, collective punishment, human rights abuses. Government troops attacked civilian communities suspected of supporting rebels, Extrajudicial killings, torture, and arbitrary detention were widespread. The military couldn't defeat the rebellion militarily. The rebels knew the terrain, could move across borders, and had external supports, so they targeted civilian populations instead. The rebellion dragged on for years. Neither side could win decisively. The rebels couldn't defeat the Malian military or force the government to concede independence. The government couldn't suppress the rebellion or eliminate the armed groups. The conflict became a stalemate punctuated by periodic violence, humanitarian crises, and failed peace agreements. International mediation eventually produced a series of accords in the mid-1990s, the National Pact of 1992, and subsequent agreements that promised decentralization, development, investment, and integration of rebel fighters into the national army. The rebellion officially ended in 1996 with a symbolic burning of weapons in Timbuktu's main square. But the underlying problems remained unresolved. The promised development never materialized. The decentralization was minimal and ineffective. The integrated fighters were often marginalized within the military. The North remained poor, underdeveloped, and politically marginalized. And the climate crisis continued accelerating. Desertification advanced. The Niger River levels continued dropping. Traditional livelihoods became increasingly impossible. The population of Timbuktu and surrounding regions became more dependent on international aid and remittances from diaspora communities. This is how you create perpetual instability. You combine political grievance with economic marginalization and environmental catastrophe, and then you refuse to address any of it meaningfully. The Malian government treated the northern rebellions as security problems to be suppressed rather than as symptoms of legitimate grievances that required political solutions. Climate change didn't cause the rebellions, political marginalization caused the rebellions. But climate change made the grievances impossible to ignore and the situation impossible to stabilize. When people lose their livelihoods, when they can't feed their families through traditional means, when they're dependent on aid and charity while watching their government invest in regions that aren't theirs, they have nothing to lose by fighting. And this is where Timbuktu fits into the larger story. The city had survived centuries of imperial rise and fall. It had survived the Moroccan invasion, the Armor chaos, French colonialism, and post-independence neglect. But it couldn't survive the combination of political marginalization, economic collapse, and environmental catastrophe that defined late 20th century northern Mali. By the early 2000s, Timbuktu was an impoverished provincial city in one of the world's poorest countries, in a region experiencing ongoing conflict and environmental crises. The manuscripts were still there, carefully preserved by families who protected them through every previous catastrophe. The intellectual legacy remained, but the city itself was barely functioning. Tourism, which had briefly provided some economic activity in the 1980s and 90s, collapsed after September 11, 2001, as Western governments issued travel warnings for the Sahel and visitors stopped coming. Timbuktu's symbolic importance as a UNESCO World Heritage Site didn't translate into economic development or infrastructure investment. The city was trapped, too famous to ignore, too marginal to invest in, too unstable to develop. The myth of Timbuktu persisted globalite, remained shorthand for remote, exotic, adventurous travel, but the reality was grinding poverty, climate stress, and a population watching their cities slowly die, while the rest of the world used its name as a metaphor for distance. And then, in 2012, everything that could go wrong did go wrong simultaneously. The Libyan civil war destabilized the entire region. Gaddafi's regime collapsed. The Tuareg fighters who'd been in his service returned to Mali, heavily armed and deeply committed to achieving what previous rebellions had failed to accomplish. And this time, they brought al-Islamist militant groups who had their own agenda and who viewed Timbuktu's intellectual heritage with open hostility. Next time someone tells you climate change is just an environmental issue, remember, the Sahel droughts didn't just kill livestock and dry up rivers. They destroyed entire economic systems, forced populations into permanent displacement, and created the conditions for decades of conflict. Environmental catastrophe is always a political crisis waiting to happen. But droughts, as destructive as they were, at least left the manuscripts alone. They didn't care about books. They didn't have an ideology about history. They just made life harder for everyone equally. The militants who arrived in 2012 cared very much about books. They had specific ideas about which history was acceptable and which needed to be erased. And they brought pickaxes. In 2012, Islamist militants occupied Timbuktu and started destroying mausoleums with pickaxes. They burned manuscripts, they banned music, and then a bunch of librarians pulled off one of the greatest heists in African history. This is the part where everything we've talked about, the decentralized manuscript preservation system, the private household storage, the scholarly families protecting their heritage through centuries of chaos, proves its value in the most dramatic way possible. Because when armed militants decided that Timbuktu's intellectual history was heretical and needed to be destroyed, the fact that the manuscripts were scattered across hundreds of households meant they couldn't all be targeted at once. And the fact that local families viewed those manuscripts as irreplaceable treasures meant they were willing to risk their lives to save them. 2012 was supposed to be the year Timbuktu's legacy died. Instead, it became the year that legacy was rescued, evacuated, digitized, and secured for future generations. The city lost its mausoleums, but it saved its soul. Let's talk about how Mali collapsed so spectacularly that militants could occupy a UNESCO World Heritage Site for 9 months while the international community watched. The crisis started in Libya, when Muammar Gaddafi's regime fell in 2011 during the Arab Spring. His extensive security forces disintegrated. Among those forces were thousands of Tuareg fighters from Mali, Niger, and other Sahel countries who'd been recruited into Gaddafi's military over the previous decades. These weren't just soldiers, they were experienced, well-trained, heavily armed fighters who'd been promised support for Tuareg independence movements in exchange for their service. When the Libyan regime collapsed, those fighters went home. They brought their weapons with them, lots of weapons. Assault rifles, machine guns, anti-aircraft guns, rockets. The Libyan military arsenals were looted during the civil war, and huge quantities of advanced weaponry flooded into the Sahel. In January 2012, those returning fighters launched a new rebellion in northern Mali. They called themselves the MNL Ether National Movement for the Liberation of Azawadand. Their objective was the same as previous rebellions: independence for the northern regions and the creation of a Tuareg-led state. But this time, they weren't fighting alone. They'd formed alliances, sometimes explicit. sometimes opportunistically with various Islamist militant groups operating in the Sahel. These included Ansar Deen, a Salafi jihadist group led by Iad Jali, a Tuareg himself, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghrib Akim, which had been operating in the region for years, and Muyo, another jihadist faction. The alliance was tactical and temporary. The MNLA wanted independence and secular governance. The Islamist groups wanted to impose strict Salafi interpretations of Islamic law and had no interest in Tuareg nationalism. But both sides opposed the Malian government, and that was enough for cooperation in the short term. The Malian military collapsed spectacularly. Within weeks, the rebels captured most of northern Mali, including Kidal, Gao, and Timbuktu. The army retreated south in disarray. In March 2012, frustrated junior officers in Bamako staged a military coup, overthrowing the government and plunging the country into political chaos just as the north was being lost. By April 2012, the MNL controlled most of the north and declared independence for Azawad, but they'd already lost control of their Islamist allies, who had more fighters, better weapons, and clearer ideological objectives. The jihadist groups turned on the MNLI, pushed them out of the major cities, and established their own governance. Timbuktu fell under the control of Ansar Dine and AQIM, and they immediately began implementing their version of Islamic law, which bore no resemblance to the sophistication Maliki jurisprudence that Timbuktu's scholars had practiced for centuries. Music was banned. Women were forced to wear full veils and could not appear in public without male guardians. Smoking was prohibited. Alcohol, obviously, was forbidden, though given that Timbuktu was already a predominantly Muslim city, this wasn't a major imposition. Public punishments were instituted for religious violations: flogging, amputation, stoning, and then they turned their attention to the city's cultural heritage. The militants viewed Timbuktu's traditional Sufi practices as heretical. Sufism, the mystical tradition within Islam that emphasizes spiritual experience and often venerates saints and scholars, had been central to Timbuktu's religious life for centuries. The city's mausoleums housed the remains of revered scholars and holy men, and local residents visited these tombs to pray and seek blessings. To the Salafi jihadists, this was shirk idolatria, violation of Islamic monotheism. They considered the veneration of saints to be polytheistic, and the mausoleums themselves to be physical representations of that heresy. So they decided to destroy them. Starting in June 2012, militants from Ansar Dine began systematically demolishing Timbuktu's mausoleums. They used pickaxes, shovels, and their hands. They filmed themselves doing it and distributed the videos online as propaganda, claiming they were purifying Islam and destroying monuments to idolatry. 14 of Timbuktu's 16 mausoleums were destroyed or severely damaged. The tomb of Sidi Mahoud, one of the city's most venerated scholars, the tomb of Alpha Moya, the tomb of Chikel Kiba, structures that had stood for centuries, that represented the city's spiritual and intellectual heritage, reduced to rubble in days. The international community reacted with horror. UNESCO denounced the destruction. The International Criminal Court opened investigations into cultural destruction as a war crime. But nobody intervened militarily, not yet. The world watched, condemned, and did nothing. And then the militants turned their attention to the manuscripts. The Ahmad Baba Institute of Higher Learning and Islamic Research, the modern facility that housed thousands of manuscripts and served as a research center, was targeted. Militants broke in and burned or stole approximately 4,203 manuscripts. They set fire to collections, tore pages from books, and destroyed centuries of accumulated knowledge. This is where the story could have ended in catastrophe. If Timbuktu's manuscripts had all been centralized in one location, they would have been completely vulnerable. The militants could have destroyed the entire collection in a single action, erasing 7 centuries of documented intellectual history. But the manuscripts weren't all in one place. Most of them were still in private households, scattered across the city and surrounding areas, stored in wooden trunks, in family homes, exactly as they had been for generations, and the families were ready. Abdelkader, Hyderabadi director of the Savamadi CI organization, which managed several private manuscript libraries, had been watching the situation deteriorate and planning. He understood that if the militants discovered the locations of the major private collections, they would destroy them just as they destroyed the Ahmad Baba Institute's holdings. So he organized a rescue operation, in secret, while Timbuktu was under militant occupation. The operation was logistically insane. The manuscripts were fragile. They couldn't be exposed to moisture, extreme heat, or rough handling. They needed to be transported in protective containers, and they needed to be moved out of militant-controlled territory to somewhere safe, which meant getting them to Bamako, over 400 miles south, through multiple checkpoints and across territory where government forces and militants were actively fighting. Haidara and his network of librarians, families, and volunteers began evacuating the manuscripts in late 2012. They packed them in metal footlockers and plastic containers. They hired vehicles, cars, trucks, whatever they could get. They bribed checkpoint guards. They disguised manuscript shipments as ordinary cargo. They moved at night when surveillance was minimal. When the roads became too dangerous, they evacuated manuscripts by a canoe down the Niger River. Picture this: librarians paddling wooden canoes through the night, carrying hundreds of pounds of medieval manuscripts in waterproof containers, navigating a river under the threat of militant patrols and military airstrikes. Over several months, between late 2012 and early 2013, approximately 350,000 manuscripts were evacuated from Timbuktu and northern Mali to Bamako. 350,000 moved secretly under occupation by civilians who understood that what they were saving was irreplaceable. Some manuscripts couldn't be saved. The 4,000 burned at the Ahmad Baba Institute were lost. Families who couldn't participate in the evacuation because they were too old, too afraid, or didn't have the resources had to hide their manuscripts and hoped they wouldn't be discovered. Some were damaged by moisture when buried underground for safekeeping. Others were damaged by insects or deterioration during storage in suboptimal conditions. But the vast majority survived because the decentralized preservation system that had protected the manuscripts through previous crises worked one more time. The militants couldn't target what they couldn't find all at once, and by the time they realized the scale of the evacuation, most of the manuscripts were gone. In January 2013, the French military intervened. Operation Save la French-led military campaign supported by African Union force, he's pushed the militants out of northern Mali's major cities. Timbuktu was liberated at the end of January. The occupation had lasted 9 months. The militants, realizing they were being driven out and apparently determined to inflict maximum damage on their way out, set fire to the Ahmed Baba Institute's new library building. The modern facility burned, but the manuscripts, the ones that hadn't already been evacuated, had been removed by staff who'd hidden them elsewhere in the city. The building was destroyed, but its contents survived. The aftermath revealed the scale of both destruction and salvation. The mausoleums were rubble, but they could be rebuilt, and they were, using traditional building techniques and knowledge passed down through generations of local craftspeople. UNESCO and the Malian government funded reconstruction. By 2015, most of the destroyed mausoleums had been restored. The manuscripts were safe in Bamako, stored in climate-controlled facilities, and increasingly being digitized. International organizations, including the Prince Claus Fund and various universities, provided funding for digitization projects. The goal was to create digital copies of the entire collection, making the knowledge accessible globally while preserving the physical manuscripts in secure conditions. And in 2016, the International Criminal Court achieved something unprecedented. They convicted Ahmed al-Faqi al-Mahdi, one of the Ansar-Dine militants who'd participated in destroying the mausoleums, for war crimes, specifically for the intentional destruction of cultural heritage. This was the first time the ICC had prosecuted cultural destruction as a standalone war crime, establishing an important legal precedent. Al-Mahdi was sentenced to 9 years in prison. He later expressed remorse, whether genuine or strategic is debatable, and participated in reparations programs. But the conviction sent a message. Destroying cultural heritage is a crime against humanity, not just vandalism. The world finally recognized that erasing history is an act of violence. But Timbuktu itself remained in crisis. The city was liberated, but it wasn't secure. Militant groups continued operating in the region. Government forces and UN peacekeepers maintained a presence, but they couldn't prevent occasional attacks. Tourism, which had already collapsed after September 11th, showed no signs of recovering. The economy remained dependent on aid. The manuscripts were saved, but they were in Bamako now, not Timbuktu. The intellectual heritage had been decoupled from its geographic origin. The city that had preserved this knowledge for 7 centuries no longer housed it. UNESCO maintained Timbuktu's status as a World Heritage Site, but added it to the Endangered Lista designation reserved for sites. Facing threats so severe that their preservation is uncertain, the threats weren't just from militants. They included unauthorized construction that damaged historical sites, urban pressure from population growth, inadequate infrastructure, and ongoing climate stress that continued accelerating desertification. The Niger River levels kept dropping. Lake Fagabine remained dry. The desert continued advancing. The pastoral economy that had once sustained the region was effectively dead, replaced by humanitarian dependence and remittance-based survival. And yet, the legacy survived. The manuscripts, digital and physical, were preserved. Scholars around the world could now access Timbuktu's intellectual production through online databases. The Tariq al-Sudan, the Tari al-Fatash, Ahmed Baba's biographical dictionaries, the astronomical tables, the legal commentaries, the medical texts, all of it documented, digitized, and available for research. The 2012 crisis proved something important. Timbuktu's real treasure was never tied to the physical city. The manuscripts could survive independent of the buildings that housed them. The knowledge could be preserved even when the mausoleums were destroyed. The intellectual legacy transcended geography because it had been documented, distributed, and protected by people who understood its value. This is both triumphant and tragic. Triumphant because the rescue succeeded against enormous odds under occupation. At great personal risk, the manuscripts were saved. Tragic because the city itself remains gravely wounded, economically devastated, environmentally stressed, and caught in ongoing conflict that shows no signs of resolution. Timbuktu today exists in a strange, liminal state. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site experiencing unauthorized construction and infrastructure collapse. It's a legendary city whose legends are more widely known than its actual history. It's the birthplace of an intellectual tradition that's now studied globally but barely supported locally. It's a place where climate refugees replaced the nomads who founded it, where digital archives replace physical libraries, where international attention focuses on past glory, while present survival remains uncertain. The manuscripts left Timbuktu, but their content, the accumulated knowledge of 7 centuries, the proof of African intellectual sophistication, the counter-narrative to colonial myths about a continent without history, is now everywhere. Preserved digitally, studied academically, accessible to anyone with internet access. The city that shouldn't have existed, founded on a small dune 20 kilometers from a river in the middle of a desert-survived Moroccan invasion, armor chaos, French colonialism, post-independence, neglect, climate catastrophe, and jihadist occupation. It survived because the people who called it home refused to let it die. They hid manuscripts in their homes. They rebuilt mausoleums from rubble. They paddled canoes through the night carrying irreplaceable documents to safety. Timbuktu's golden age is over. The trade routes have shifted. The empires have fallen. The river levels continue dropping. But the city's greatest achievement documenting its own existence, preserving its own intellectual production, proving that African scholarship was sophisticated and mentors not in the desert, not in the buildings, but in the minds of the scholars who study it, the families who preserved it, and the digital archives that ensure it will never be lost. So here we are, at the end of 11 centuries of history, and I need you to appreciate the absurdity of what we just covered. Timbuktu was founded by nomads who looked at a patch of sand 20 kilometers from the nearest water source and said, "Yeah, this'll work." It became one of the world's great intellectual capitals, not because of gold, though everyone assumed it was gold, but because scholars wrote everything down and families spent 700 years protecting those manuscripts like they were the most valuable thing on earth, which, it turns out, they were. Europeans spent 5 centuries fantasizing about streets lined with gold, sent explorers who died trying to reach it, and when they finally arrived, they were so disappointed by the mud brick buildings and poverty that they decided to invade anyway. The French conquered the city, immediately decided it wasn't worth the trouble, and then spent 70 years proving it by investing precisely nothing in the region while wondering why the North kept rebelling. The city survived Moroccan muskets, ending 500 years of empire in an afternoon. It survived 114 coups in 79 years. That's 1.4 regime changes per year, which is not a government, that's barely organized chaos. It survived droughts that turned lakes into dust and forced entire populations to abandon the nomadic lifestyle that had sustained them for millennia. And then, in 2012, when militants showed up with pickaxes and ideology, determined to erase Timbuktu's history because they decided 7 centuries of Islamic scholarship was somehow heretical, a bunch of librarians said absolutely not and smuggled 350,000 manuscripts out of an occupied city. By car, by canoe, in secret, while people with guns were actively looking for them. Let me say that again. Librarians pulled off a heist to save books during a military occupation. This is the most heroic thing librarians have ever done, and I say that with full respect to everyone who's ever helped me find a book in the Dewey Decimal System. Here's what Timbuktu's story teaches us. Geography creates opportunity, but people create legacy. Empires rise and fall on predictable cycles. Centralization brings prosperity. Fragmentation brings chaos, and the cycle repeats until somebody shows up with better weapons. Climate change doesn't cause conflict, but it makes every existing problem impossible to ignore. And knowledge, real knowledge, outlasts everything. It outlasts the empires that patronized it, the cities that housed it, and the militants who tried to destroy it. The manuscripts that documented Timbuktu's golden ages are now digitized, studied globally, and accessible to anyone with internet access. The city that created them is still struggling with the same problems that have plagued it since French colonialism: marginalization, underdevelopment, environmental catastrophe, and a government in Bamako that still treats the North like a security problem rather than a region deserving investment. Timbuktu's physical city may never recover its former glory. The trans-Saharan trade is gone, replaced by container ships and aeroplanes. The Niger River keeps dropping. The desert keeps advancing. The tourism that briefly provided revenue has collapsed. The city exists now in a strange space between myth and reality, famous globally, struggling locally, preserved digitally, but threatened physically. But the intellectual legacy that's secured, that's permanent, that's available to every researcher, every student, every person who wants to understand that Africa had sophistication, literate, scholarly cultures long before Europeans decided to discover them. The manuscripts are the receipts, and they're not going anywhere. So the next time someone uses Timbuktu as shorthand for the middle of nowhere, you can tell them they're half right. It is remote, it is isolated, it does sit in the middle of a desert that seems designed to kill anyone who tries to cross it. But it was also one of the intellectual capitals of the medieval world, a city where scholars debated astronomy while Europeans were still arguing about angels on pins, a place where families protected knowledge through invasion, occupation, famine, and climate collapse because they understood something fundamental. Empires are temporary, but ideas are permanent. Timbuktu shouldn't have existed, but it did, and its legacy documented, preserved, and rescued against impossible odds proves that the greatest treasure was never gold. It was always knowledge. And unlike gold, knowledge doesn't run out when you share it. It multiplies. All right, engagement time. What surprised you most about Timbuktu's story? Was it the literal pound for pound gold salt exchange, the 114 coups in 79 years, the fact that manuscripts were evacuated by canoe during an occupation, Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what made you go, wait, WHAT. And if you're wondering what other historical myths need debunking, or what other legendary places turned out to be completely different than expected, let me know. I'm always looking for the next deep dive into history's most misunderstood corners. Coming up next, we're diving into the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history that established an independent nation, terrified every slave-owning society on earth, and gets suspiciously little coverage in most history classes. It's brutal, it's brilliant, and it features one of history's most fascinating figures, Toussaint Louverture, the former enslaved man who defeated Napoleon's armies. You're not going to want to miss it. If you enjoyed this journey through 11 centuries of desert drama, manuscript obsession, and librarian heroism, hit that like button. Subscribe for more historical deep dives that actually respect your intelligence, and share this with someone who still thinks Timbuktu was just a myth. Until then, sleep well. There are more stories to come.